Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. It helps out the show a ton. And you can follow us on Instagram.
Enjoy.
So, I don't know either of you. I don't know like really anything about what you guys do, what you're into, what you like your expertise, any of that stuff. You guys could just like give me an intro.
Yeah, this is like a radical political podcast. I didn't know if Max told
Okay.
you.
Yeah. We're going to talk about Marxism and communist
Yeah, Marxism
manifesto.
is too far right for us. We gotta
Okay.
go. You gotta get further to the left. Oh geez, hitting stuff. Yeah. So, we both have just been doing strength stuff forever. So like I started training when I was like 17 or whatever, and you were probably a little younger even.
Yeah.
And I'm 40 now, so that's the years. We both help out with so he's the high school strength coach and head
Okay.
coach for the powerlifting team, and
1 year head coach of the football team.
yeah, one
Yeah.
year head coach is the football
Yeah,
team.
and I got out of that as fast as possible.
Yeah.
That was last year.
Yeah, so just gym rats. I'm kind of nerdy. So, if there's a study that exists, I probably read it at some point, but
Sure. Yeah.
I don't always, it's always just been for me because I love training. And so I'm always like, I read a study once and then, can't remember who wrote it
Yeah.
and all the details and stuff, but that's about where we're at.
Yeah, and so it's hard to say that's my favorite thing because I don't even know if it's true, but like I was a powerlifting coach for a long time, for the last decade. Uh, but the reason we started podcasting, kind of the idea around it was really around wrestlers.
Okay.
It was last year, just training these kids like through football season, and then a month of getting out of football season, seeing them get all healthy and their strength is starting to come up. And some of them, a lot of them were also powerlifters, so I'm excited to see their lifts coming along. And then wrestling season hits,
Yeah. Yeah.
and a month later they're sick. They don't want to lift anymore.
Yeah.
They're only doing cardio. Their emotional state is terrible. And I like me and Kyle, it's like, holy crap. Like there was only so many years I wanted to see that. So it's like,
Mhm.
man, it started off Red Gauge is actually we started off like thinking of like being a supplement company
Mm.
and trying to figure out like how can we bring kids through that same thing because you're not going to get rid of weight cuts. Like that
Right.
is going to happen.
Right.
But how can we bring information and supplementation to these kids that they're cutting intelligently, and then we started thinking like what in the hell is intelligently, uh
Yeah.
obviously like protein and things like that, but then it was like, man, what if we started looking into like sleep and psychology, and then it was like, crap, we're starting to get into something else.
Yeah.
And I don't even remember when we decided to start a podcast, to tell you the honest
Yeah.
truth. It just kind of was like it just made sense.
Yeah, because we
Yeah.
both have, Josh is a pretty competent coach. He does real good with the kids. He 9 state titles in 9 years for powerlifting, right? That was pretty cool. Won a game your first year as the football coach,
Two.
which
Oh,
2 games,
We won
nice.
2 games.
2 games. But and then my favorite thing has always been just like training economy and stuff like that. But there's whole parts of the wheel that we aren't experts in, like the um I never cut for any of my sports, right? Like it was just getting as big as possible. I am a pretty good assistant coach because I'm good at like picking up kids who have fallen over and don't know what to do with themselves, but I'm not a great
Yeah.
head coach. I don't want to deal with systems at that level and stuff, So there's a lot of the, if you think about like the wheel of training, all the different things that are aspects of it, there's, some of them that we know a lot about and we can talk about and provide good information. And then there's some of them that we don't know a lot about. And so then it became like, well, let's go find people and,
Mhm.
see what's cool and put together more content. So out of each one of these podcasts, we've gotten like a topic or a list of topics that we'll make more content about, like,
Oh, awesome.
we talked to Max a bit about, just basic training principles, right? And so we'll probably do another series on training principles
Mhm.
and, how to manage them as a kid or a coach or whatever, right? And so that's kind of the idea is to put out as much like educational content as we can.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then like really just allow the speaker to speak on what they're confident in. Like we will then later digest and turn it into content for
Hmm.
whatever we're talking about, powerlifting, wrestling. I don't want guests to come on and feel like they've got to talk about wrestlers because they
Yeah.
might be like, what
Yeah,
the hell, I've never. Now, if it was somebody that was super versed in wrestling or combat sports, sure. But
Yeah. Yeah, but we're mostly just looking for trying to find information to kind of fill out all the gaps in training knowledge that people have.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, thanks for providing that. It's like good background. It helps me understand kind of where you're both coming from.
Mhm.
Your own backgrounds as like coaches and kind of involvement, and then also where the podcast is going and what you guys hope to accomplish. So that was
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah. Cool.
right, yeah, there's a lot. So in doing my research, listening to your podcast, I was like, a lot of similar topics. A lot, you know what
Sure.
I mean? Like
Yeah.
going through all of your.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then are you a high school coach? Did I hear you say
Yeah, I'm
that?
a high school strength coach for my
Oh,
for
nice.
my PhD. I do that as like the way to get funding.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Yeah, that was kind of funny because I was like, oh, we have Josh on. I had been accepted in a PhD program, but then took that head coach job at my high school.
Okay.
And I was like, I could not do, I thought I was going to be able to do both. And I was like, it's not even close. I do
Yeah.
not have enough time to do both.
Well,
So,
I coach at a high school full time, and then I'm in the PhD program, and then I also coach Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting
Yeah.
remotely, like quote unquote full time. That's actually the bulk of my income.
right.
So I coach a lot. I coach a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. That's kind of been the interesting thing is at the high school level, like I coach so much different than I think I would if it was like one-on-one.
Yeah, you have
You get to
to.
personalize it because just such a short amount of time and you have such a
Yeah.
difference of clients. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't even know. I think I could get good at it, but I would probably be terrified if, like, when somebody asks, like, for a one-on-one personalized thing,
Yeah.
like, I've
Yeah.
been doing it such a,
If
I
Brian
had
Shaw came to
10,000,
you and said, "Write me a program."
just go back on
Yeah.
his own podcast and look for something he said. Think you'd like this, Brian.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have a unique perspective in that I've coached, and I love telling the high school kids this. I've coached a woman to squat 500 pounds.
Yeah.
And then I've coached like medalists at a national level, like American Open finals in weightlifting. I've coached people who were, top 10. I've coached people who are medalists in the Philippines, New Zealand. And then I coach one of the best weightlifters in Canada. And then I also coach kids who are like 13,
Uh-huh.
like middle school football players who come in and they've never seen a barbell, touched a barbell. And then I'll coach kind of them to kids who we have a kid who I think he's gotten offers from like WVU and maybe Purdue and other schools like that, like D1 schools. So it's interesting. And then also coaching those like high level weightlifting and powerlifting athletes one on one versus coaching 40
Right.
baseball players and,
Uh-huh.
and, and cross players and football players all at once in like an hour and 15-minute session.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Like the approach is wildly different. And that was not a steep learning curve because steep implies short. That
Right.
was like a steep and drawn out learning curve.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was insane for like the last 2 years to
That's what
train.
I tell most people. Like, if I'm getting kids in that environment to 80% of their potential, I probably have done a good thing because
Yeah.
it's just so much just managing, putting out fires, keeping the kids in the right, in the
Yeah,
right spot,
totally.
doing the right thing. And
Yeah, and you never realize like once you've been in the game for a long time, there's a lot of things that you just take for granted, right? That kind of unconscious competence portion of
Yeah.
like learning a skill. And so you get a group of like 30 kids and you're like, "All right, guys, let's go learn how to squat." And you don't realize that you know 7,000 things about the squat that you need to teach them about, so that they can have a good time. So, yeah.
uh,
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot. His group, he always says that the programming that he does for his classes is never what he would do if it was just one-on-one because you just
Right.
can't get, you can't get the amount of instruction through to the kids.
yeah, and I try to change it because not every group is the same. So even from class to class, it can take on its own identity.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
so through the evolution of the years that I've been doing it, like I joke, like I wouldn't even ever coach this way, but
Mm,
somehow it is what the class needs
yeah.
in just little weird intricacies. I just try to get as much work in because we have the kids for about 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So as much and just where we're at, like kids aren't really coming to us very strong. They're not coming to us very fast. So
Yeah.
you got to pick and choose what we're going to do. And so it is what it is. But
Yeah, yeah, you got to measure what you're doing, right? There's no
yeah,
10-foot death drops for
10
your
foot
brand
drop.
new brand
Right.
new athletes.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Who can survive?
Who can survive? That's the program. So, yeah, what are you working on for your PhD?
So we've done a little bit of work. We've gotten force plates from Hawken Dynamics, and we have been doing like a lot of jump testing with the high school athletes.
Yeah.
We actually ended up doing a presentation on a bunch of data we collected at Coaches College, which
Hmm.
is like a really well-known, renowned sports science and strength conditioning present like few days of presentations at East Tennessee State
Yeah.
with Michael and Meg Stone, who are, Michael Stone is basically the like godfather of American sports science. He wrote the Principles and Practice of Resistance Training.
Hmm.
He, he's authored more publications than I probably can count. And he has like just a hugely prestigious background in sports science. And then his wife, Meg Stone, was a D1 head strength coach at a football. She was the first female D1 head strength coach for a football program.
Cool.
I think that was like, in the 90s or 80s. And
Yeah.
she's been a head strength coach kind of, here and there since. She was an Olympian as a thrower.
Ooh,
So
what a
they're
name.
like, yeah, they're like insanely successful in what they do, and they ended up going to Tennessee and East Tennessee State and starting the program that's basically produced. Mike Israetel graduated from that program. He has a PhD in sport physiology. Christian Carter, my mentor, Guy Hornsby, and then handfuls and handfuls of people come from that program and end up becoming very competent
Hmm.
professionals like sports scientists. So that, for me, we won, in a roundabout way, we presented at that conference, which was really unique and really, really cool.
Yeah.
Uh, Also to kind of be a part of that lineage has been really interesting for me. And the actual information we presented on was mostly descriptive. I mean, almost entirely descriptive. It's like, how do high school athletes what's their like neuromuscular like ability look like in a
Right.
counter movement jump that's unloaded and loaded. And the loaded condition is important because you're trying to, as your co-host Josh mentioned, a lot of these kids who come into high school, they're not very strong and they're not
Hmm.
very explosive and they're not very fast. So, they might jump high. You might see a kid who can kind of jump pretty high and get a
Right.
nice like pop off the ground. And then you put a barbell on his back, you impose a little bit of load. Um, and suddenly that number might be stifled because it's like to move something beyond their own body mass can be a big, big challenge.
Yeah.
And athletics is really all about manipulating other people and manipulating implements
Right.
or utilizing the ground in some way to generate force.
Yeah.
So we looked at, unloaded jumps and loaded jumps and tried to look at like fall off. So if kids are jumping on average, say like, you know, 15 inches, how does that change when you put some sort of implement on? How does that change performance? So we did a bunch of that. We've been doing that over the last like year and a half. And then my dissertation as of now, the whole process of kind of like figuring that out and trying
Hmm.
to decide what makes sense, um, is actually going to be comparing two measures or two tests of isometric maximal strength. So if
Okay.
you look in the literature on performance and performance monitoring, like athlete monitoring,
Hmm.
you'll notice there's a ton of work with the isometric mid-thigh pull.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the gold standard.
Uh-huh.
It's like how do you measure force production, and then how do you measure the rate at which that force is produced to know if your athlete's improving and becoming a potentially better, sport athlete, like player.
Right.
We could get into a bunch of different rabbit holes. I'll try to be concise, which I'm not. But the
We
reason
got
that's
time.
used is, the reason that's done is because you put the athlete in like an athletic stance, right? They're in the power position, knees bent, hips flexed, up and down, strapped to a bar, and then they produce force as as maximally and as rapidly as they can. And then you get two values. You get peak force, and then you get rate of force development across different time bands. So within 0 to 50 milliseconds, 0 to 100, 100 to 150. And then you could say like, okay, how steep's the curve? And then how stretched out is the curve? We want
Hmm.
it to be steep. We want them to be really brutishly strong. And then we want that curve to be steep. We want it to be fast.
Right.
Because in a sprint or a lot of like change of direction movements and ground contacts, the amount of time you have to act on the ground, to act on someone else, to respond to some sort of like external cue, it's very short.
Hmm.
Right. So it's not really just like how strong are you, but it's like how quickly can you produce that force to use it. So isometric mid-thigh pull, there's a great paper. It's something along the lines of like isometric mid-thigh pull testing 25 years later, and it's kind of like a synopsis on why that would be a useful athlete monitoring tool and just like a tool to use and kind of more generally. So we're taking that, and then we're taking something that's kind of been a more recent like innovation on that, which would be an isometric belt squat. So it's saying like the
Okay.
mid thigh pull is complicated by the fact you have to strap up to a bar, get into a good power position, and then try to run athletes through that. And Josh, as you would know, in like a big team setting, if you're trying to run kids through some sort of like performance testing or monitoring
Yeah.
testing, like it would just have to be slow if you have 40 kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you're constrained by time. So it's like, what's a way to obviate that? It's like to simplify the task, to make it easier to learn and easier to do. So you would do there's some research looking at isometric belt squat, using that to similarly measure force production in like an athletic power position, and then measure that rate of force development. So basically, as of now, it's going to be comparing those two tests to say, hey, what are the differences in force? Like peak force values and then rate of force development, how do they compare? And then when you use those to calculate a DSI, which is looking at kind of like your explosive strength, and your ability to produce force in a counter movement jump versus your ability to produce force isometrically. And then you get a ratio which would tell you like, oh, you're kind of slow, or oh, you're really explosive, but you don't produce a ton of force.
Hmm.
Um, it would say like how would an isometric mid thigh pull and then an isometric belt squat like test fit into calculating the DSI or the dynamic strength index.
Okay.
So tentatively, like in the 2 years I've been here, that's kind of where we've gotten to in terms of like figuring that out and learning the skills along the way to be able to kind of incorporate it and get to work on it. But a PhD is a process beyond just like a singular study or
Yeah.
series of studies. You have exams and checkpoints and benchmarks and classes, and so like navigating the kind of like chaos of that has been the most complicated part of the journey. And then I feel like once coursework's done for your PhD, you switch into proposal mode, dissertation mode. I'm in my last semester of classes, so once I round this
Okay.
out, like besides the summertime, which I'm actually in the process of, well, I applied to intern with UFC as a sports science
Oh,
intern.
cool.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. But like beside that, like the proposal and dissertation, that stuff is almost like the simple, straightforward stuff, which would be,
Right.
setting up the tests, running participants through it, getting the data, getting the results, and then analyzing it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that I like that idea of moving from the mid thigh pull to the belt squat. I know I'd read some mid thigh pull research a long time ago, and one of the big criticisms that I walked away from it was that it was untrained, and then they were doing interventions on untrained athletes,
mm,
right? And so on the initial pull, they had pretty lackluster results. They trained them for a few weeks, they did it again,
sure.
and as you mentioned, like coordinating all that effort, like it's a full body chain of motion when you're doing a mid thigh pull, right? And
Yeah,
so like
totally.
just having done it once before is probably going to have a pretty significant impact on what you do after you've had a couple good nights sleep or whatever. So I think that's pretty cool doing the belt squat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought about was sometimes you get some of your best athletes that just come to you athletic, so they're not necessarily interested in working real hard. Like, well, I already can dunk. Why would I train?
Mm, sure.
Whereas this might show them like, look, yes, you are explosive, but you're not powerful.
Mm,
We might be
right.
able to if we can get you powerful, like you're not going to dunk, you're going to be able to slap the top of the backboard,
Hmm.
and that's what something that is, I feel like in some rare occasions, but the better the athlete sometimes is, it's harder to get them to actually buy into the weight room.
Yeah, it's good because it's like, well, my abilities are like sufficient or beyond sufficient for like the current context I'm in.
Hmm.
It's like I'm the guy, right? It's like, what else would I, I already can dominate. And it's like, well, but at the next level,
Right.
there's a stark change. Like that
They're,
difference is steep. That change is steep. Um, which is interesting too. I think like being in the high school context and having to work through some of the complications of that has been really interesting. Um, because it really isn't just like a matter of, want. It's not just like a matter of want. It's a matter of like if or can. And then it's also like, as you mentioned, what's the nature of like the sport itself, the sport coach's involvement, um, and so many different like other inputs. Whereas you talk about coaching like weightlifters and powerlifters, that's like a luxury. That's
Yeah.
like that's like the most relaxed thing possible
yeah.
because one, they come to you and they're likely paying you like
Hmm.
like individually, and then they're more mature, they're older, and then they like have all those character traits. So it's like they're much more dedicated, committed, interested, thoughtful, they're smart. They're not like 14-year-old boys who just don't have brains. Um,
They're
so
growing
like
them. They're growing them. They'll get there.
they'll get there eventually. But they come to you and it's like, okay, hey, I want to be the best that I can be. Can you help me get there? And it's like, yeah, we totally can do that. And they're like, okay, it's going to take a long time, right? And it's like, yeah, it's going to take a really long time. And then, 5 years later, you're on the podium on a national platform, and you're like, yeah, we kind of saw this through, and we kind of figured out like what we wanted to do. We figured out how to get there. When you get into like a high school setting, it's so much more complicated.
And
So much
you
more.
don't have that time
Right? Yeah,
for them
exactly.
No
Exactly.
5 year
yeah,
spans.
their goals,
Yeah.
you don't get the kids for that long.
Yeah, we'll get kids their senior year, 6 months into their senior year, and they're like, I want to join the powerlifting team. We're like, all right, let's do it. But then you know that it's a 4 month season, and so what can you do in 4 months?
Yeah, totally.
I mean,
Yeah.
lots of good stuff. You can teach them how to use a weight room, and they can do that for the rest of their lives, but
Yeah.
you're not going to
Yeah.
get them to a 500-pound bench or anything.
Well, and I think kind of to your point, so what I think is kind of cool about the way I approach all this stuff. So I've been immersed in like, you had Max on the podcast. I think Max and I are basically a reflection and a mirror of each other. And that we know like a lot about training theory. We've read a lot of the same resources. I've read more papers and talked to more researchers and had my hand in that pot for as long as I could have imagined. And like, I just like in sickening, to a sickening level of commitment. Like there are 2 years where I coached a weightlifting club in Columbus, Ohio, and I went into the club every single day and coached every single day because I knew that if I could see them more and more reps, right? If I could
Hmm.
see more and more lifts, I'm going to be able to pick up on that pattern recognition. And
Right.
Right.
to quote John Marcus, good coaching is thinking in patterns and not pieces, right?
Yeah.
Being able to see a pattern emerge in a lot of like disparate data.
Right.
So like my whole thing is like, okay, can I read more? Can I consume more content? Like listen to more podcasts, all of that, have more conversations. Then can I see more reps? Can I write more programs? Can I coach more? And then can I do that over like a long enough span of time? And I've done that probably for like 10 years now at every single level imaginable, right? From again, working with like 13-year-olds to working with people who are in their mid 40s, mid 50s, people who are on national podiums, and people who are like, what's a snatch? What's a
Yeah.
clean and jerk? And I've explored that in immense detail, like the deep physiology and the deep psychology. And really, I think you made a great point, which is the underlying message of this stuff at heart really should be, hey, this is very, very useful for performance, but it's also useful for your health
Yeah. Yeah.
and for
Right.
you living a life that's like worthwhile and meaningful.
Yeah.
And I've kind of like felt that shift in myself of the conversations I have in the high school weight room definitely gravitate towards like, hey, we're gonna crush these squats to hit bigger squats. Also, I want you to do this for the rest of your life. Like, how do we make that happen? How do we keep it fun? How do we keep it something you like look forward to? And then when you're done, you're like, I can't wait to go to the rec. and
Yeah.
I'm going to figure this out. So I think that's like a critical conversation that is sometimes missed when we just talk about performance.
Yeah, one of our guests, we put a little quote on the wall for every day, and one of our guests brought a quote for us, and it was, "Once you've wrestled, everything else is easier."
Yeah,
And I think that there's a lot of truth to that with anything hard. Like once you've
yeah,
done
totally.
anything hard, everything else is easier. And the weight room gives you such a great opportunity to, you know, be tired, not feel good, not be in it, have a rough breakup, like training's been going poor, and then come in and do the dumbest like volume squat session ever and like
Yeah,
just be like, okay, we did it. Like I didn't want to be here, I didn't want to do it,
yeah.
I did it anyway. It's gonna count when I go to bed tonight. Like that. I think that's a really really valuable skill for kids to pick up, for the whole rest of their lives, wherever they get it from.
Yeah, especially if they're in a healthy gym environment and
Yeah.
people
Oh,
are
totally.
actually
Yeah.
excited
Hmm.
for their PRs and stuff, you know what I mean? Like not everybody's setting a record, but
Right.
like our big thing is anytime somebody hits a PR, there's a big bell. They have to go over and ring it and
Oh,
everybody
nice. That's
cheers.
awesome.
Like
Yeah.
we don't know what you just did. No one cares. We're just cheering because you're happy for it. Like now if they're on Instagram at all points of time and they're, Googling how good is a 275-pound bench for,
Right.
like
Right.
it might not be as healthy, but still.
Yeah.
No, and
Yeah.
I think to that point, like one thing I also am mindful of, so the program I'm in, the doctorate program I'm in, there's a good amount of conversation around um that however this word's going to come off, but inclusivity from the standpoint of like how do you get more people into coaching? How do you get more people into like athletics
Right.
and being active, right? And being capable of being active. And I did a project around female strength coaches and kind of looking at like, okay, what's the percentages of like female head coaches in athletics, like NCAA Division 1, 2, 3 athletics. Okay, what about coaching women's sports? What about coaching men's sports? And then I was looking at that from like the standpoint of, okay, what about strength and conditioning coaches? And no surprise, it's like a disproportionate amount are men or
Hmm.
male,
Right.
and it's hard for women to get in. And when they do, they kind of like gatekeep a little bit. But the reason why that's important is because again, my conversations when we get like a women's team in the weight room, might be something along the lines of like, hey, you would be a great strength coach. Like I would seriously think about that because you show a lot of like interest and passion for lifting. You coach your teammates up really well. So, again, it's kind of that idea of like, uh, you know, like you guys have probably seen those like chicken nuggets that have like hidden peas and carrots. It's that idea of like how do I hide in that like
Uh-huh.
promotion of like being physically active your entire life? How do I hide in that like empowerment through lifting weights?
Yeah.
But also not just empowerment, but like, hey, you can make a career out of this. Like
Yeah.
you're way better at coaching this than all the other kids, or you have a much stronger passion for it than anyone else. Um, so I think like we take really good training that's really effective and gets those kids strong because that's what I love. But it's like, okay, now that they're in the weight room, they're interested and they're like killing it. Like, okay, how do we make this like way bigger than just, heavy circles going onto a steel rod that you're throwing up,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I know before I started teaching, we're both teachers, right? And so before I
Okay.
started teaching,
What do you guys teach?
I had math. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. And I'm just the strength coach. I'm in the weight room all day.
yeah,
Yeah.
So I used to be the
Nice.
health teacher, but then
yeah,
moved over to this like five
Yeah.
years ago.
yeah.
So
But
nothing. I get paid to be in the gym all
yeah,
day. It's pretty fantastic.
but I know, teaching is an interesting thing because it forces you to deal with coaching too, right? Forces you to deal with
Yeah.
some of the psychological biases you have. And so like I kind of had always grown up being like, oh, everybody could be good at this if they just tried a little harder or whatever. And I didn't realize how much variability there really was in people in terms of like skill acquisition and, communication and all that kind of stuff until I started having to work with, 120 different kids every day.
Mm. Wow.
And the the comment you made about finding somebody who seems like they're good at it and like trying to encourage them. I'm like, when I find kids who are good at coaching other kids in the weight room, I'm like, you don't understand how rare this actually is. Like having
Yeah.
an eye for movement and having an eye for like the person and being able to communicate with them well and just remembering because there's a pretty good size. It's not the most complicated subject on the planet, but there's a pretty good size volume of data that you should know if you're going to be coaching people in a weight room, right? And the handful of kids that I've had who are really good at that, I was like, hey, you should really think about doing this more, because the world needs it.
Yeah. Well, I
and
mean,
them
on that,
wanting to do it.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, on that idea of individual differences, like there's a lot of really good research, and Craig Pickerington's like a researcher who did a lot of good work around individual response to training.
Yeah.
Um, and John Kiley too. They have a lot of good work, but you know, some of the findings are really surprising in that like you can put people on physical activity programs like training programs, and if you're measuring health outcomes, you might see their health outcome like the way you're measuring and defining health.
Uh-huh.
Those measurements might get worse, right? So someone could do something like some sort of physical activity, some sort of training, and then markers of health decline or get
Uh-huh.
worse. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Well, it's not that physical activity is bad. That's an illogical leap. What
Right.
it means is that there's an individual response to some sort of imposed stress.
Yeah.
In that case, it's some sort of physical stress, be it aerobic, or like tension, like force based. That extends through every single aspect of like the complex world we exist in. Is
Yeah.
that you have physiology, you have this like underlying complex system that responds uniquely to stressors.
Hmm.
And that means that like whatever that imposition is, whatever stress you're imposing should be unique and individualized to the person.
Yeah.
um, so you talk about like, some kids might come in and they might pick up on coaching, they might pick up on different tasks, different skills. um, there's a probably intellectual differences, but like if you have this very black and white view of like, oh, you're just unathletic or you're just stupid, that's like the least science
Right.
evidence
Right.
informed
Right.
like opinion you can have, and it's just bullshit.
Uh-huh.
And it's really unfounded. I think it's really unfair to people
Yeah.
too. So I would say like, everybody can get better, everybody can improve. We might be at different starting points. But if you're a competent coach, you can always come up with some sort of training protocol, training program that would
Mhm.
elicit the response you want, which is bigger weights, heavier, more weight on the scale,
Right.
or whatever kind of like the performance outcome is.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
so
you
I
see that.
like that you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah, you see that a lot at the high school level of like that's probably the biggest thing that I wind up doing is figuring out how to have a relationship with all these kids, like trying to learn at least enough. There's a lot, so I don't get to learn everybody intimately, but learn them enough to realize what our conversations need to look like to get them
Sure.
to keep going.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
some can be pushed really hard, some need to be yelled at, some need to be told that they're doing a great job and then tell them what's going on. But you just see some of these coaches that the only approach is, the 80s style football. I'm just
Yeah.
going to burn everybody to the ground and that's going to make everybody great. And it's like,
Uh-huh.
that sucks, man, because that means I'm working twice as hard rebuilding that kid after you leave this
Yeah.
room, man.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um the we've all there's always with the modern social media, right? We always run into that where the kids like they do something and then they go and look it up and they're like, "Man, I suck at this." We talked to Max about this a little bit, but
Yeah.
like kind of going along with what you're saying, I have to have that conversation with kids all the time of it being like, "Hey, not everybody doesn't start out in the same spot, and we have no idea where you'll go. Like that's one of the hardest things to predict.
Yeah.
Like as a coach, you're always like drooling over getting the kids who are big and strong and fast and everything, but sometimes they, like you can throw everything in the kitchen sink at them and they don't get a ton stronger and faster. And other times you have kids who come in who are, kind of uncoordinated and they aren't real effective when they start, and then they end up doing monstrous things. And it's, like it's always really important to invest in the idea that like, I can find something that's going to work for me.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I can like
Yeah.
there's avenues to explore, and you don't know what it is that you're going to be in the end.
Yeah. When I think I might be slightly like, because we could talk training. I could talk X's and O's like all
Yeah,
day
yeah.
long. Like I like the most detailed aspects of programming, but I think the those like foundational aspects of especially in a high school weight room. Like I run mine. I don't know how everyone else runs theirs. I don't know how I would know that, but like I tend to enforce these like ideas that I think are just beneficial for the group, beneficial for every kid, which is it's no cell phones, no
Yep.
headphones.
Yep.
We're on task. We're working as groups. Like we work in our teams. You're spotting, you're coaching, you're not sitting.
Hmm.
right? So like I try to make it this like, okay, what are the skills beyond just the lifting of weights that's going to have
Yeah.
some transferability outside of this? And then I think about like, okay, what do I really like when I'm in the weight room? One, I'm like a conscientious, organized, or orderly person. So it's like the weight room's going to be managed really, really well. It's going to have a good flow. There's going to be good energy, and we're going to lift weights correctly and lift big weights and push ourselves.
Uh,
Um, I love seeing huge lifts. Like I love it. Like I love watching someone squat 500 pounds. The thing I love more than that is having, 15 kids on a command, all
mhm.
doing cleans perfectly as a group. And then it's like next guy up, everybody's doing perfect cleans, right? Everyone's movement's crisp. Everyone's got a good rotation. Everyone's like having fun, and it feels really professional, really like sport like. Like that's a really rewarding feeling as a strength coach. It's like
Yeah.
being able to create that. Um, and then notice that like, okay, all those kids, all different points along their development, the one thing they have in common is they know how to freaking operate in this weight room,
Yeah.
right? They know how to run a session with me, and they know how to run a session with three guys on a rack all going at the same time, and then loading the right weight, taking good attempts. Um, Start to finish, an hour done, going out to sport practice. Like to me, that's really rewarding because
Uh,
there's just so many things you can't control in a high school setting. Like
Yeah.
the reality of it is, it's like, hey, I couldn't get a ride, so I missed one session that week. It's like, well, if you only had two sessions, you missed 50% of the work.
right.
It's like, I don't know you can't really plan for that if you're missing three,
Right.
4 sessions a month. You missed half the program, half the
Yeah.
block.
There's no way to make up that volume in a later training session or anything. It's just gone.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, it's just those bigger picture items for me that are like I try to drive those home a bit more than like, yeah, it's like a kilo or two here and there. So that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's smart because I'll get super like you super into the weeds on like training economy, training principles. Like I will happily talk all day, every day about what like the ideal thing is for whatever your goal is. But my big weakness in the weight room is working with groups. Like
Mm.
I've always been a one-on-one kind of person, and so like all of those things that you were just talking about are skills you can use the whole rest of your life, right?
Yeah,
Like
totally.
communicating and
Yeah,
coordinating with others and working hard and showing up for whatever it is that you're supposed to be showing up for and being
yeah,
accountable, right? Those are all amazing life skills to have. Just like learning how to use the weight room is an amazing, predictor for your health for the rest of your life, right? Um, Knowing how to work with others is a major predictor of your success for the rest of your
yeah,
life,
totally. Yeah.
right? And so, what are the things like what's your process? Like when you get a new group, right? How do you take your new group from when they clean, they look a little bit like they're trying to terrorize themselves with the bar, right? And
Yeah.
they don't know what a squat is. Like, what's the process in your room? How long does it take to get a group of newbies to have their first session? And like, what are the check marks that you look for between brand new and first solid session?
Yeah. I mean, the great thing is, the thing I love about this is like my when I first started, I was like such a shock to probably everyone who's coming in because it's like, hey, there's no house shoes. We're not wearing slippers. There's I'm not a Huberman guy. I don't know if you guys are. I don't subscribe to like that
Well,
like esoteric optimization stuff.
uh-huh. Yeah,
But
same.
yeah, I listened to a podcast and he had Jordan Peterson on. I'm a Jordan Peterson guy. I'm like his like more like life stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, and Huberman was saying something about like he went with his dad to the movies and his dad was like, "Oh, everything's going to hell." And he's like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Yeah, people are wearing their pajamas to a movie theater." And I think about like kids coming in the weight room and how they'll wear like pajamas or like house slippers.
Right.
And to me, what that is a sign of is like you think you're kind of above everyone else. You can just kind of show up casually and you're like cool for it. Um, and I try to get rid of that as fast as I can. It's like, no, it's like wear something athletic, right? Be professional. Not that you're like a paid athlete, but the idea that like you take pride in showing up, being ready to work, and kind of holding yourself to the same standard that everyone else does.
Yeah.
So when you walk in the weight room, it's going to be, athletic gear, it's going to be closed-toed shoes, no headphones, no gum, no food. You come in, you're ready to work. As soon as that clock hits, right? As soon as it's 2:45 on a school day, they get out at 2:30. Okay, everyone's lined up in front of dumbbells, and I'm briefing over the session. Okay, we
Yeah.
all have sheets. We all have printed out sheets. I have a template I use. I'll write every training day in, and I'll write the days across the weeks. I'll brief on that. We run a warm up as a group, and then I got this idea from Hannah Swerpel. She's another local strength coach, but it's like a prep circuit. It's a 5 minute circuit. We have 3 exercises. You do as many rounds as you can do, and they're generally movements that aren't targeted well. So it might be like a push up, a pull up, and then maybe some sort of like midsection work. But
Josh, if
that
any of my kids listen to this podcast, they're going to be like, dude, Monroe just had this guy on. Like, you are literally just explaining my entire program right now.
oh really? Oh, that's
Every
hilarious.
single thing you've said. I might have to show this tomorrow to my class.
Just be like, look, I'm not crazy. I'm not
No,
crazy.
not
Yeah.
not at all, right? So like, and to me, like the session feeds into the session. Everything's like, it's the way I think about programming. It's like I
Mhm.
wouldn't put it on the sheet unless you should do it. I wouldn't tell you to do it unless it's like a critical part of getting better, right? I'm not going
Right.
to tell you to do leg extensions because I want you to go put your finger in your nose and like sit on the machine, right? So every part of the session feeds in. You come in, you line up, you get ready to warm up. That feeds into, okay, we're talking about the session. What's like resonating with me too, because I try to pull some life lessons in and say like, hey, you had a great workout last time, right?
Uh-huh.
One workout's awesome. One workout does shit. One
Right.
workout doesn't do anything, right? You
Right.
need thousands of workouts.
Yeah,
So
it's
let's
10 years to get somewhere. Let's go.
right. So so come in next time, have another great workout, right? Let's keep this trend going. So that feeds into the prep circuit, which feeds into the workout, which is going to be more explosive based movement. In general, I've been having just the entire team do cleans or jerks, and we'll just go, I've taught seminars on weightlifting. So I've taught like, clean intros and jerk intros and snatch intros before. So you just scale that down, say we're going to warm up with a front squat, a muscle clean from the power position, a power position clean, and then we'll start getting into like position 1 and position 2 from the top or from the knee or from the floor. And then we just like sequence that, right?
Hmm.
So everybody's doing front squats, everybody's doing muscle cleans, everyone's doing cleans. And then we just break positions down. And that'll run for like 10 to 20 minutes. And then it's onto like a pull, an RDL, and we'll superset that with maybe like upper body power, lower body power. And then we'll kind of feed into more like accessory, kind of like hypertrophy work.
Right.
But that's like an hour and 15 minutes. It's pretty fast paced, and everybody's moving all the time. And one thing I also picked up, because good strength coaches pick up stuff from strength coaches. Supersets are a strength coach's best friend, because if you
Yeah.
just have one movement and you have 3 people in a rack, people just stand around, they
One
talk.
person standing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
get disorganized, and as much as I like kind of like keeping things in a good like flow and routine, I don't like babysitting, and I don't like saying like, hey, can you guys break up the chit chat? Like
Yeah.
we got to work. Someone's got to be on the bar. So having those supersets and saying like, hey, go across the room, hit some plyos, right? Hit some hurdle jumps, hit some like rear foot elevated single leg jumps, like get some more speed work, and then we'll come back over to the more force
Yeah.
focused work. And that just like, again, that session kind of runs itself after that. So
Yeah, like kind of going back to Josh's comment about getting to 80%, like training, like in terms of like maximizing output, supersets might not be your most valuable tool. But in terms of like keeping the class in line and like keeping
yeah,
people engaged and motivated and stuff, right? Like there's nothing wrong with them, right? Like it might be better to give them 4 minute rests in between
yeah,
and, like really dial in, go
yeah.
watch each one and make sure the
Yeah.
tonnage is right for them and, all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But it definitely is, makes it harder to manage.
Well, the quote you could probably write on the board that I like. It's from Thomas Sowell, who's like a famed economist
Yeah.
who Mike Israetel will cite all the time. I think this was in a book, but it was something along the lines of like some woman was talking to him, and she's like, "Hey, the people want solutions. We want solutions." And he's like, "There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs.
Yeah.
And every single thing you do is a trade-off."
Yeah.
And it's not like that's not like a quip, right? It's not like just like a funny, cute saying.
Yeah.
It's
It's
like
100% true.
every single thing you do is like it's a time trade-off, it's an
Uh-huh.
energy trade-off, it's some sort of like economic trade-off. So when you go to the store and you buy like this oatmeal versus that one, it's like you either paid more, you got less calories, you got more sugar, you got like less fiber. So, it's like this awareness of, okay, if my decisions matter, to Josh's point, it's like we're going to do supersets that maybe aren't as fatiguing or tiring or useless. So if we do plyos, we get more touches.
Hmm.
If we do jumps, we get more touches.
Right.
And that's going to be almost like, maybe you could make a case that potentiates something, but at least we get more touches instead of, and we're not going doing like stretches. We're also not doing heavy rows or like heavy pull-ups or something like that, where it is globally fatiguing.
Right.
Right.
So that like strength coach situation is really like you're a master of trade-offs. We have an hour and 15 minutes, and it's like what's going to be the most beneficial to the kids, and that doesn't just look like numbers and sets and reps and exercise on a piece of paper.
Yeah. So if we were to sum up that little bit, like if we were given other coaches advice, it would be create an engaging period of time
Yeah.
and then focus on the character traits of being a trainer, of improving as like a young person.
And
Right.
Yeah, I think
figure out
that's
what works
totally
in your
right.
space too. Like
Yeah, totally.
I have another coach that looks to me for a lot, and so I kind of showed him like what we naturally do. But then he got to his school and it's super low income, and he was like, Monroe, the bars don't spin.
Yeah.
He's like, what? And
We're
I
not
was
going
like,
to do a
well,
lot of
I was like,
snatches.
yeah, okay, well, probably should avoid most of these. Kind of took out like here's some things that not doing the same thing, but
Yeah.
it's close. It's close. So you gotta fill out your space.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and I
We
think,
are pretty fortunate. We got, 14 full racks and
Yeah, we have a
whole
nice
sets of
space.
dumbbells and towers and everything. So,
Just not necessarily the most prepared athletes sometimes.
yeah.
We do get plenty of kids that are ready to go, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think to Josh's point, one, like when I started there, we had like these oversized like fat bars because
Yeah.
they're like more affordable. And we had every rack had like this huge bar, and we got freshman girls come in and they're like, I can't
Can't
hold
hold
it.
a 33 millimeter bar.
No, I was like, they're like, I can't wrap my head around
yeah,
it. So what I did is I took it to the head football coach at the time, and he took it to the booster club,
Yeah.
and they got all new weightlifting barbells. And it's like that's also like an awareness thing though. As like a weightlifting coach, I know how important that is. So
Uh,
I found a cost-effective alternative that's like the right size. It spins well, and it's like affordable, and it's for the entire school. So it's like this one purchase benefits every kid who comes in the weight room,
right.
not just the football team, not just the baseball team, but it benefits everyone. So I think like that, and thinking about like how you can be ingenuitive
yeah.
to kind of make the program what you need it to be is really really useful. Yeah,
Just like a group of athletes with the best grip strength coming out of that school
Yeah,
for the
everybody.
last
Yeah,
10
totally.
years. Like,
We only train on an axle. Nobody can deadlift or squat or bench press very much, but goddamn, we got grip strength.
uh,
Yeah.
so one question I wanted to throw in, but we were on a roll there. Like, do you feel so? I believe your last podcast was 275.
270, maybe 274, 275, something like that. Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. Like,
Yeah,
congratulations
congratulations.
there. Like,
Oh, appreciate it. Appreciate it.
I don't know where you started with. We're on 5. Well, yeah, 5 or 6, depending on we messed up
Yeah.
numbering already.
Don't you
but,
love that it's like we own our own podcast and we can't remember?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I tried to put the episode number up here, and on one of them I forgot to do it, and it was just us talking, so it's become episode 3.2. But
There you go.
this is really 6, but it's 5.
But to think like 275, that seems so far down the road. Do you
Yeah.
feel like
Yeah.
it's been fast? Like, or do you feel like, man, I've been podcasting for so long?
Yeah. A saying I picked up in academia, which is I was talking to I think she's the school director for the School of Sports Sciences, but she said something along the lines of the days are long and the years are short.
Yeah.
It's like recording a podcast, getting one out. It's like, man, this feels like it might be a little bit of work. It takes a little bit of time. And then suddenly I'll look back on episode like 255 and I'm like, I thought I just recorded that. Like, I
Yeah.
remember those episodes being so much more recent. And then I look way, way back and I pulled up a picture, a handful of weeks ago, and it was when the podcast was at like 500 downloads or 600. And we're like right on the cusp of 250,000. And, or I am, because there's no one else, right? It's just
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's like right on the cusp of 250,000. Like, holy shit. Like
Right.
that. It's insane to think we weren't close to this the entire time. Like, it feels like I was just at 230 and then 235 and then 240. But no, it's like you have to start from zero. You have to
Yeah.
start from dead scratch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing I tell people because of that, so kind of to that point, is just start whatever you're doing. Like I would love for you to live with that feeling of loss and failure and frustration than live with the feeling of regret,
Uh-huh.
right? Like inaction.
Yeah.
And there's a quote from a podcast I did with Todd Cashin, who's just a star, you know, a rock star psychologist, and he puts out incredible work. I'm actually going to get him back on the podcast. You guys should totally reach out. He's into like bodybuilding and lifting weights.
Yeah, yeah.
And he talks about avoidance, like avoiding action. And he's like, when you avoid, you have this unsatisfied curiosity. Like you have a curiosity. You're like, I wonder if I go ask that woman if she'd like to go out, what would happen? You have that curiosity. If you don't satisfy that like feeling will calcify. And then if it calcifies long enough, you're just kind of like looking back on your life thinking of like, I know I could have, but I never did.
Hmm.
And what would have happened? And Max probably, I don't know if he told you about this, but prior to like 2022, I lived in Columbus and I was working as a weightlifting coach and I was making decent money and I was coaching full time and that's like what I wanted to do. But I always had this like idea of, the people I look up to who are in weightlifting and in academia, they travel to go do what they want and they
Yeah.
go to find people and they
Yeah.
work with them. They get mentors, they work for other businesses. And Max did that with Juggernaut.
Uh-huh.
So I like ran into Max in Vegas. We were both coaching at Powerlifting Nationals. We were in a coffee shop. He was sitting across from me. He's like, "Hey, yeah, I'm kind of looking for someone to run my gym and be the head coach." And I was like, "Hey, like put a pin in that. I'll call you when I get back to Columbus." 2 weeks later, I drove across the country from Columbus to Vegas and then to Oakland, and I lived on Max's couch for 2 months.
Yeah.
And then like ended up working with him for the next year. And then I got into this PhD program. And then I drove back across the country. And since Max and I have written books together, which are on the Weightlifting House website, like hosted speaking events through Weightlifting House. I've like presented at the coaches college, like done all these crazy things. I
Mhm.
actually got my first paper published on personality and
I just
elite.
read it.
Oh, really?
I have a bunch of
Very
questions
cool.
about it for you. We'll get
Yeah,
it.
but like all these things manifested out of that idea of like with the podcast, it was just I want to put my thoughts out there and see what
Right.
happens. So I implore people every time I talk to them, like I don't give like fucking start the podcast, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
do the thing, and then if you fail, like live with the feeling of failure. Don't
Yeah.
live with the feeling of regret. Like,
That's what Max.
100%.
That's what Max did to us.
Yeah.
'Cause, we were talking about like there was nothing, and
Yeah.
Kyle just reached out.
We had obviously we haven't even published any shows yet. Like we're kind of trying to play the algorithm a little bit and publish
Yeah.
the first 5 or 10 all at once, right?
Yeah.
And so I just was like, I'm just gonna reach out to like 15 people I really want to talk to.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
and I kind of like my consumption of strength media really dovetails with my ability to train. So
Okay.
at some
Yeah.
point we might talk about my insane injury history, but I when I'm not training real hard because something's flared up, I don't consume as much, and then when I am training, it's like it's part of my buy-in, right? And
Yeah.
so I just wrote the 15 people who had all produced stuff that I had thought was really valuable. And I wrote Max, and then I was halfway through writing the next person, and he wrote me back and was like, "Oh hell yeah, man, let's do it." And then
That
I
was
was like, "Oh no, like we don't
Yeah,
even
we
we
were
didn't
like,
we didn't have
even
a
have a
space, we didn't have
microphone, like-
microphones, we didn't have
So
anything."
he just
Yeah.
launched us into it, which was awesome. It's what we needed.
Yeah, good kick in the ass.
Push.
Yeah. But kind of the same thing, right? Like I'd always really everybody makes their choices, and I made my choices to hang out here and be close to family, and
Yeah.
my wife's family's all
Yeah.
here and everything, and but like I had always Benedict Magnuson always has this great story about going to live in a tent in a field next to the gym that he wanted to train at, and
Yeah.
I had always really like admired that, kind
Yeah.
of same thing, right? I was like, I
Yeah.
want to go live in a field illegally to train, with the people I want to train with, and so this is really scratching that itch for me. I've really enjoyed
Oh, that's
talking to
awesome.
people about training.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, just to jump in really fast, I think, humans, I love psychology. Like I if I didn't get a PhD in coaching and all that stuff, I'd get a PhD in psychology.
Right.
And humans become very acutely comfortable with their like current situation, right? And it's not just
Uh-huh.
like situation, it's like everything in their life. Because to some extent you put it on like autopilot because the number of inputs would be paralyzing if you had to think about them and decide and
Right.
change.
Yeah.
So everything kind of becomes like static and kind of like comfortable. The only downside with that is unless you introduce chaos and like uncertainty, nothing changes, which like that could be fine. But also when you do introduce it, so like with the podcast, right?
Right.
You introduce some sort of uncertainty, some sort of like chaos. You actually can't predict what's going to happen because of that. You
Right.
know,
You have no
which
experience navigating unknowns.
totally. So like you might actually this might be hyper successful. You might get brought out to do live podcasts at some sort of like some sort of convention, some sort of expo. Suddenly you guys are up on a stage talking to like hundreds of people. And like that may sound like a pipe dream, but when I moved to work with Max, we did seminars in Canada and we'd fly out to like Calgary and do seminars and teach people to fucking lift weights.
Right.
And you just don't expect it until it happens.
Uh-huh.
But like the only way you can get to that it happening is to introduce that like chaos, that like ignition or that igniter that allows it to like manifest, right?
Yeah, yeah. I tell the kids all the time. I'm like, they say like I am studying or I am practicing or I am whatever. And I'm like, dude, don't lie to me. Like humans are 99% habit, like you got to find opportunities to get in there and disrupt it.
Yeah,
And it's going to
totally.
be
Yeah.
uncomfortable and you're not going to
Yeah.
enjoy it, but like that's a really important part of moving forward as a human, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Can't live in the 99% habit all the time.
Yeah, and so I know what we've talked about this a couple of times, but so in 275 episodes, do you think that you've learned more, or someone that's listened to every episode has learned more? Because I
Yeah, it's
feel like
actually
already I'm like, holy crap, after 275 episodes, like, I already feel like I know some,
Uh-huh.
right? Like I know a lot more than a normal human. But it's like, oh my God, dude. I'm just thinking about all the avenues we can just learn
Uh-huh.
directly.
Right.
It's like almost jumping into a college class and you get to pick what professor
right.
you want to talk to you,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, well, and that's actually a really astute point. Like, thanks for making that, which is even the degree like this program before starting it I had never been a strength coach. Like
Yeah.
I just coached Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting and I just coached adults. So like my background was purely can you snatch and clean and jerk a PR, can you squat bench and deadlift a PR. Yeah, I
Right.
never worked with kids. And then I got into this program and it's like day one was you have 30 female like freshman, sophomore volleyball players who are going to be in this weight room, like train them. So from that day to now
Uh-huh.
is like so much unbelievable growth as a coach and as a communicator and as strength and conditioning professional that like I wouldn't have anticipated because it's not written into the syllabus, right?
Right.
Like with a with even the PhD, like, oh, you'll take these classes, you'll learn this stuff, and then you'll get a degree. It's like, no, none of the stuff you actually learn is necessarily written in. With the
Right.
podcast, it's the same way. You get guests on, but it's like, what's the background work you're going to do? What's the conversation you're going to have? And then how does that like unpredictably shape the future to where you're like, yeah, that thing he mentioned about John Kiley and how individuals like can respond poorly to physical training. I'm going to deep dive on that. Then
Uh-huh.
you look at Craig Pickerington, he comes on the podcast. Suddenly you do an episode on individualizing training, and you're like, holy shit, like I actually know more than like 99% of the people who like think about this stuff
Uh-huh.
Right.
and read about
Yeah.
it. So
And not to get too far in the weeds, but that, like the responders and non-responders is always really interesting
yeah,
because like I've had kids who are non-responders. Like we go in
yeah.
and we do a 6 week training thing and they get 5 pound weaker, and then I'm like, okay, we're just doing, I'm scrapping the, volume is king advice that I normally give. And we're just going to give you like some super high intensity work. And,
Mm,
you know how to do the movements now. We can probably do them safely and everything. And then they'll come back and they'll be 20 pounds better at the end of 6 weeks or
yeah.
whatever. And it's like, a lot of that non-responder might also be the interventions that you're using, right?
Yeah, I mean that concept like non-responder, it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah,
It's just like you just didn't do a good job formulating the training
right,
stress, right?
right.
Yeah.
Like you didn't manipulate volume, intensity, exercise selection, range of motion, tempo, all those things to like
Mhm.
to create an effect. And when you coach someone for 8 years, yeah, they could be a responder for like month 1 through 6 and then drop off and then pick
Right.
back up and drop off. Like I've had people they'll come in waves, like big progress, dip down, plateau.
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, what do we do? It's like, well, you measure training so that you can change training.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's do a lot more of it. Boom, suddenly big bump up. It's like, well, they weren't a different person. The training just wasn't what they needed at the time
Yeah.
based
Yeah.
on a variety of whatever it is. So, um, non-responder, it's more so like I think bad coach.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and part of that is like you take that responsibility on so you can change the situation. If you say
Yeah.
like, no, you're just not going to get better, it's like, well, where's the responsibility? No one has responsibility. So
Yeah. And
suddenly you guys are just kind of in this like deterministic frame
yeah.
where you don't respond to training, you probably shouldn't do it. And it's like that's not empowering and that doesn't place the onus or responsibility on either person.
And like you said earlier, you can't go into a project thing saying like, oh, you can't get better, right? Or you
Yeah, yeah,
can't learn
totally.
or whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's an insane thing to do to somebody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's all yeah, non-responder is always non-responder in this particular environment with this particular set of circumstances and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and one to Josh's point about the podcast, I actually coach a guy. His name's Jordan Brown. Every people I coach, they've listened to almost every episode, if not most of them, and I
Yeah.
guarantee you they can program better than I can by listening to the same stuff.
Right.
Like, and a lot of that is honestly just they and this is a quote from Todd Cashton, but when he talks about curiosity and doing something meaningful, he talks about like, well, you take your expertise and then you mix it with someone else's expertise, and then you get this like really unique thing that you didn't have before. And he calls it like you take, your chocolate and put it in my peanut butter, and suddenly you
Uh-huh.
have this like really awesome thing.
Right.
Uh, so like I have my background, I have my experiences, I have my biases. Like I worked with Glenn Pinlay, and I'm not like I probably swore off 5x5s just because of Glenn. It's like Glenn would give you 5x5s and you would not make progress, and then you would keep doing them, and you're like, Glenn, I missed the fifth rep on my 5 rep max every single training block.
Right.
I'm not like at the same weight.
Yeah, 8 weeks in a row.
Yeah, it's like Glenn, I can't do that again. And he would get like I remember I had a program where I would do squat 5x5s, and then every single training day on a weightlifting program I had like a snatch pull or clean deadlift 5x5 or like 3x5.
Hmm.
So like go in back squat 5 sets of 5, clean deadlift 3 sets of 5, next day snatch deadlift 3 sets of 5, next day clean pull 3 sets of, it's like I was doing sets of 5 and pulls every single day of the week, plus squats, plus weightlifting. Uh, so I'm not, yeah, so I kind of swore that off. So like that bias, it was just like in my programs, like, oh,
Hmm.
you don't program 5x5s, you don't
Yeah,
program
they
like,
don't exist.
Really,
yeah, because of
Nobody's
Glenn.
gonna do it.
5x6s and 5x4s are all over the place, but
No 5x5s.
Well,
Yeah.
that's always the joke with Glenn, or Seb would make with Glenn was well, why can't we do like a 6x4 or 4x6? He's like, well, we're just gonna do a 5x5. It's like that's the
What we're
same,
doing.
it's the same fucking thing. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, in my early training history, the first several years, I got into training for track. Track was my thing, and I ended up getting hurt, and it didn't end up becoming anything. But I did keep training because I love training, and I was very much like if it's less than or if it's more than 5 reps, it's cardio, And
yeah,
I told the story on the podcast before, but like the most I ever benched with that kind of mentality was like 365, 375, and
yeah,
then when I came back to training after having a couple years off when I was having kids and stuff, I was like, okay, I'm gonna follow my own advice. Like I'm gonna write a program like I was writing it for somebody else who had my same training
yeah.
history and all that kind of stuff, right? And after my first real like 3 month volume block, my bench press was 440 or something.
Wow,
It was
holy
like
shit.
80 pounds more. And so it was like, okay, well, I really shot myself in the foot for like
Yeah,
8 years in
yeah,
a
yeah,
row,
yeah, yeah.
sticking with the 5x5s and the 6x3s or whatever. But, you know,
it's just what the training was
yeah,
when we were learning.
yeah. That was our, we both had the same weight room coach, and he had started training in like the late 40s or early 50s. He used to tell us
Wow.
a story about he ordered his first plates out of a magazine, and I have them. I stole them from him. He ordered his first plates out of a magazine, and when he went to pick them up, he would let the air out of his dad's Model T so that he could just put it in. He could
Wow.
set the throttle, and it would just go down the railroad tracks. And then loaded up his plates and brought the Model T home on the railroad tracks, and that
That's
was and
insane.
so he saw everything. Like he saw the rise of steroids.
Yeah.
He saw sport really become powerlifting, weightlifting, bodybuilding, and But his emphasis was definitely on, you know, like the lower reps and explosive stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah, that was his baby.
Yeah, but I think that's where it's like being kind of critical of different just like strategies or approaches
Hmm.
or schools or camps or whatever it is, and saying like, well, what works?
Yeah.
Like I'm a huge fan of what works, and I've come up under like a very block periodization, like 10-5-3-2
Yeah.
like protocol. Like that's it.
Yeah.
Everything's tens when we're doing tens. Everything's five when we're doing fives. And that's like as block periodization as it comes
Yeah.
for various reasons. I've also done, more like daily undulating stuff.
Uh-huh.
I've done, programs where it's like, okay, we have a certain number of repetitions. We need to dole that out over the training week.
Right.
And we break it down in whatever way makes sense. I've done everything from like ice cream fitness 5x5 to like a block periodized program to like a Travis Mash. What you realize is like, okay, what are the things that really, really matter? It's like you have to pick the right exercises. Like,
Hmm.
you have to be competent in that. Okay, what really matters next? Like you have to do enough work. Like you have to do sufficient work. And then it's like, okay, well, what intensity? It's like, well, the amount of work you do decides the intensity.
Right.
Because if you say you can only do 1 rep a week, how heavy are you going to do it? You're going to go to
Yeah.
max. You're
Yeah.
not going
Yeah.
to do 50% for one.
I'm gonna
But
make
if you
people
say,
rescue me. You know,
what's that?
I'm gonna make people rescue me. I'm gonna put 1,000 pounds on
Yeah,
the bar and try to bench it every day.
see what happens. Yeah, no warm up. But like if I said you have to do 1,000 reps a week, you're not going to go to max on any one of those. You're going to do the bar for all of them, or
Yeah.
maybe less, right? You're going to figure out how to do like anti-gravity training.
Yeah.
Uh, so if I told you, okay, hey, you guys have to do 300 reps this week, how are you going to break it up? It's like, well, we're going to try and do some higher intensity stuff, but to do that, we have to balance it out with some lower intensity stuff. And that's when you get into like really successful, really effective programming, is when you can take the amount of work, which is a
Mhm.
driver of progress, and distribute in a way that makes sense based on, resources, adaptations, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's
like,
kind of when we have kids who start getting into programming, because we always try to encourage that a lot to get kids to
yeah,
start writing
totally.
their own stuff, right? And the very first conversation I have with them is kind of that Charlie Francis, like you've got a cup with so much, right? So like
Yeah,
be careful
totally.
about where you're spending it because, like you said, you can't do 1,000 reps at 100% capacity or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
you got to adjust those sliders on volume, intensity, frequency, all those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. I mean, fatigue management, I think when coaches can manage fatigue really, really well, that's the sign, that's like the hallmark of a very successful, experienced coach.
Yeah.
Someone who can take you and say, do this training, and you're just going to you're going to do enough to get better, and you're not going to do more than that.
Yeah.
That's rock star coaching.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier training powerlifting and weightlifting is kind of a luxury.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
something I think anybody watching this for sport needs to understand, or even bodybuilding, it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if you're watching this and you train athletes, like there's a whole extra component of work that you
Yep.
have to account for, right? So like I love training and I just like lifting heavy stuff. I structure my training in 5-day rounds. I got a couple days off out of those 5 days and just repeats every 5 days, right? Because it's the easiest way for me to manage fatigue and do
Mhm.
the exercises I like doing as frequently as I can do them with as much volume or intensity as I can do them. But if I am coaching a football team or a wrestling team that competes every Thursday, then all of a sudden it becomes like, okay, well, maybe that frequency slider you don't have as much freedom with because you can't get all your kids to come in on
Right. Yep.
Sunday to train or whatever, right? And so um, it's so much easier. You almost are operating in a vacuum when you're doing powerlifting or
Yeah.
weightlifting.
Yeah.
Like you do have to worry about life stress and diet and sleep and all those kinds of things, but you don't have to worry about the volume that you put into your sport, and it's really really important to manage that as part of the total program.
Yeah, but I think with weightlifting and powerlifting, like with S&C, you could probably get away with like doing a less good job if people are just like not hurt and they're getting
Uh-huh.
through
Yeah, yeah.
workouts and they're
Yeah.
like training. You're like, yeah, everybody's like training hard. Everybody's
Uh-huh.
got a good
Right.
pace. Everybody's coming in consistently, like attendance is up. In weightlifting and powerlifting, if kilos aren't going on the bar, you're
Oh
bad.
yeah.
You're
Right.
bad at your job. You're not like
Yeah.
you're gonna get fired,
Uh-huh.
because it's like a team not winning because you are the sport coach.
Yeah.
You're the sport coach and you're the strength coach. So if someone is regressing or if someone's like banged up, it's like that's your fault and you got to
Uh-huh.
fix it.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a luxury because it's slow,
Hmm.
but it's the most transparent
Uh-huh.
thing
Because it
Yeah.
is the
imaginable.
sport.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and it is interesting too when you see that. Like I've been in gyms long enough that I've seen a lot of people who, you know, they can't translate from one thing to another.
Mm,
And so you
right.
really start to wonder like, well, how good is what you're doing in the first place? Like,
Yeah.
is it just something you picked
Yeah.
up from somebody else? Like how much variety are you building into your own thing? How much
Right.
growth is there in your own practice? You
Yeah,
know?
totally.
How much time as a coach do you think you spend like reflecting on the day or on the training block or on the year if you're getting a new group of kids?
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. It kind of depends on the day, right? Like
Yeah.
the weekends are my big programming days. So I was in the office. I was at the office on the on campus, and I wrote out the month of training for lacrosse, wrote out the month of training for girls soccer, kind of looked over baseball, kind of looked over football a little bit, and then I kind of like I've been tinkering with the template. And what you realize as a coach is like if you change the way you have to format your training, you'll change the training.
Uh-huh.
Because suddenly you have all these like suddenly it's like okay, well, the flow is different. So I'm writing exercises in differently.
Mhm.
The boxes I give myself, the way I write like sets, reps, weight, tempo, like even having like a tempo box, you just realize like all those things to some extent like subconsciously change the way you program. So I would say on days where I have like a big bulk of work, so I'll do all my weightlifting and powerlifting stuff tonight. I already started on that. I think about it all day, probably way too much. And then when I'm at the high school coaching, I obviously think about it. And then when I leave, it's like, how was the session? Was it good? Was it bad? What could have been better? Um, I mean, even some of the classes, like in my program, one of the classes my mentor is teaching, and it's strength and conditioning program design. So multiple days a week, we're talking about like volume load, or we're talking about displacement, or we're talking about like, the periodization literature. And then I'm taking like a biomechanics class. We'll talk about, different forms of like data filtering. So probably all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, just
All the time,
24/7. Catch as much as
24/7.
possible.
Yeah, and well, and I like really kind of have like this I really have like a curiosity, like knowledge focused like lifestyle because it's school, it's work, and it's like getting through this into the next aspect of like how am I going to turn this into a profession or career. So I just spend a ton of time like thinking, working, reading, learning. It's like something I really prioritize.
Do you feel
So
like you ever like over tinker? Like,
all the time.
you know
All
what I
the
mean?
time.
It's like
No,
I feel
sometimes
like I do that
yeah.
too. Like get
No,
myself,
all the
and
time.
all my stuff is in trimesters, so sometimes it'll be a couple weeks in before I really realize, maybe it was like the
Yeah,
learning portion, but I'll be like 4 weeks in, it's like crap, I screwed it up.
yeah.
It's like
Yep.
I totally messed up something. What the hell was it? Trying to get back to a good mix, but
Well, and that's when you get like big teams in. The one thing, as a strength coach, you think about more than you would in anything else is like flow. It's like how much does that session just make sense to where kids start here, they go here, they go here, they go here, they're in groups, they're using different implements, they have different exercises. And then you'll watch a session and you're like, I don't like that. Like, I don't like the way I set up this little prep circuit because you got kids kind of cutting in front of like lines. You
right.
got kids that are slow here and fast here, not enough reps here. So I say it's all kind of this like iterative kind of process that just feeds into itself, which is actually what I think is really unique about it is like day one of being a strength coach to day, 600 or whatever it is. It's like the programs, they're similar insofar as like they all have the basic constituents, they all have like barbell movements, but like the flow, the way you coach it, the way you think about it is like night and day different, night and day.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I noticed as a teacher, like I'm always so busy that I don't ever have enough time to really think about things until like it'll be summer break or something. And so there'll be something that was bugging me for like 6 months out of the school year,
wow.
and then I'll
Yeah.
finally have 3 days off to think about stuff, and then I'll be like, oh, that was actually a really easy fix. I
Yeah.
should have done this
Just done it.
differently. Yeah.
Take notes on it, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, So when you are building your stuff for the day, do you prescribe anything? Like, do you try to get like your, skill stuff and then your speed stuff and then your power stuff and then your strength stuff? Like, do you try to stack them in order of like when an athlete can do them the best, or is that not like a secondary concern, like where you're just trying to make sure that they're doing good work and they're engaged and stuff? Is that
No,
something you think about
I
at all?
think no, I think you always follow basic principles of training, right?
Yeah,
Like, um, and then you think about flow, right? You think about like, okay, if I have these kids on a leash for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, where I just wanted to make a joke about not being a physical leash, but I didn't know if that was appropriate for the podcast. But like you have kids on a leash for like 20 minutes.
You don't ever have kids on leashes.
yeah, that's my whole classroom management plan.
We were
Yeah,
pretty
exactly.
close
Maybe
together, but that seems like we're off now.
right. But like, okay, so you have kids, it's like, okay, 15 minutes, we're all on task as a group. Okay. Now we're gonna break off into something that was like, I know they're gonna do correctly. I'm not gonna babysit them again.
Right.
Okay, so we're gonna do technical, all on task, team building stuff. Okay, that's gonna break into more like force focused, simple movements.
Yeah.
Because it really is hard. And I've been thinking about this a little bit, but like with cleans and with jerks and with snatches, like it really is hard to get like sufficient weight on the bar for it to feel like, okay, we're working, like we're cleaning really hard.
Uh-huh.
When you have big groups and you have a lot of kids and you want it
Yeah.
to be done well, it's hard for me to say like, no, we got a ton of kids cleaning over 300, like they're working hard. So a lot of that like investment with learning is like technical hands-on. Then we need things that are like force driven and simple. It's like, can we do pulls above the knee? So they're getting like a quick pop and explosion. They're moving
Right.
low and they're hitting those same positions, but we're not having to like babysit everything. It's not too light to develop them. Um, you're going to do that. Then you might go into like a even more force heavy movement, like an RDL, some type of like clean deadlift, something that's really, really basic.
Uh-huh.
And then you go into like more bodybuilding hypertrophy work, which is like mindless, good pump, big range of motion. And then we're going to put on some size, keep work capacity high. So it's that basic structure, highly skilled, speed focused, down to still skilled, like minimally
Right.
skilled, and you can kind of check out a little bit, and you're kind of just getting the work in. So I think those session structures, I'd have a hard time finding ways in which they wouldn't be the most appropriate way to approach it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you get so much more bang for your buck doing, power work when you're fresh, right?
Oh,
So
totally.
why would
Yeah.
you do it at the
Yeah.
end of your workout?
Yeah, well,
Um,
and during like a sport practice or those sessions, like everything gets mixed. So it's like
yeah,
in the weight room, we can keep it pure, where
yeah,
it's like we'll try with as little fatigue as we can to like keep speed work.
uh-huh.
And speed is just like um, mimicking or recreating the speed of whatever implement you're going to
Yeah,
use.
yeah.
So,
Your sport. So yeah, 13 meters a second if you're a shot putter and yeah,
totally,
yeah, yeah,
right? So speed, power, and sometimes it might be power, sometimes it might then follow speed just based on what we're doing. But yeah, it's always like speed, power, explosive strength, maximal strength, and then more like work capacity hypertrophy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. How do you feel? So I have a, I like to teach kids the clean and the snatch because I think it's a great set of movement skills and like a good like because you got like that kind of first and second pull and you get the drop and a catch and everything, right? So the rhythm and the timing and everything. But then I don't often have kids doing Olympic lifts as a big part of sport development.
Mm.
Like frequently I'll move them to like throwing a sandbag or a medicine ball or something for like the power kind of part of it. Like take that training volume that would be cleans and snatches and splitting it into things that are easier for the kids to do correctly with like a
Yeah,
high degree of effort, right? Or, strength work, right? What's your feeling on that for developing athletes?
I think you're pretty spot on. It's
Yeah.
like I said, man, it's so challenging to get it's challenging to get a big group doing that at like big weights.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody can clean like 135, 185, 205, 225, but to get a big group doing that with like 225, 255, 275, 300, that's where you start getting those outliers who kind of like pull themselves away.
Uh-huh.
You might have one guy who's like power cleaning 300 pounds. We have a guy, his name's I'm not gonna say his name, but he committed to WVU, I think for wrestling and for football. I don't know if he's
Yeah.
playing, but he's definitely wrestling at WVU. And he power cleans like 300 pounds. Not a terribly strong guy, but he's got this like he for like this, he maybe squats like 405, but
Right.
for the strength he has, he can access every single bit of it and
High
apply
degree of
it.
volition.
yeah, and apply and pressure
Hmm.
and apply like in a full body kind of complete way. So he doesn't have those like one-off explosive, like pop-offs, but like force he has, he uses it really, really well. But all the other teams, like I see it as those benefits you mentioned. It's a big coordination thing. You can take that with you after the fact, and then it's also like team building. It's complicated. You have to figure out how to think about lifting and think about kind of working differently in the weight room.
Hmm.
But from an athlete development standpoint, like with the where I've gotten the kids, I think I haven't gotten them to a point where I could say like the entire team's getting a ton of return from like a power development, kind of explosive strength development standpoint.
Yeah, and we had like I said, our coach had been doing it forever. He taught a pretty good power clean and power snatch. But they weren't great. There was a lot of like the finer points that were missing,
Yeah.
and um one of the things that comes along with that, right, is that there's all that extra volume of like maybe it's like lumbar flexion or like whatever that you don't think really is a big deal, but it adds up over the course of months or years of training if you aren't really dialed into what you're supposed to be doing and managing your recovery really well. And I completely lost my train of thought there, what I was going to
No, no,
say.
I'll jump in. Just my big thing is not being classically trained in it myself
Yeah.
is the same thing when I ask about like a sprint coach. Like I would love at our school, I kind of have to do everything, besides what the athletes are doing in their own sport.
Sure.
But like for the football team over the summers, like I'm the one that's out there. I can study and I can make a program that's going to look similar to a real sprint coach's program. But what I can't do is when I'm watching
Mm,
someone run,
yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't identify like, oh, his heel's coming up. Hey, pick your toe up. And all of a sudden they're changed. I got to look, film, go home for one kid, Google, oh, okay, well, maybe let's do this cue tomorrow, like
Yeah,
for one of the kids of the 100
Yeah.
that are on the football team.
Yeah.
So
I
it's kind of the same thing in weightlifting is
I
I
remember
just
my
have
point.
more of a classic powerlifting background, so I'm more used to being able to give cues in that world than
Hmm.
necessarily weightlifting. But
Yeah.
Well, one place you excel that I had it took me a long time to figure out is like how to manage an entire group and how to manage a team and how to manage every kid and like how to organize that and create that flow. So while like I can teach the lifts perfectly to any single person I ever run into, like taking that skill and translating it into like a team sport setting is really challenging. And like, I probably undersell my abilities. Like if you walk into the weight room and you watch kids do clean pulls, squats, bench, you're like, oh man, these guys are trained by someone who really knows those
right,
movements and
Uh-huh.
is a
yeah,
master of those movements. But it with the clean and the snatch, maybe in the jerk too, besides just teaching like a power jerk, which I think is very simple to teach, like
Yeah.
teaching an entire group to split jerk correctly and really, really well. So you get those fine points of like, I'd like to see the back foot touch first. I'd like to see your feet kind of slide on the platform, front foot reach out, front shin vertical, back knee down slightly, bars over the shoulders, slightly behind the ears. Like I could get everyone there, but it's like, okay, as a group, that's hard. As
Yeah.
a group, that's a challenge. And you can't do one-on-ones. You can't
Yeah.
teach kids how to
right,
weightlift
Yeah.
person to
Yeah.
person, right? Because it's like, we got 7 exercises, we got 60 minutes. I can't. There's no way that's
yeah.
feasible. So
I usually give one or two tips on the way by. Hey, here,
yeah,
do this right there.
yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
Yeah.
right there. Yep. And then I walk away and I look back and they're like, did nothing. That might have been worse.
Yeah, yeah. What I was driving at earlier, talking about our history and everything, was that if you're a coach and you don't have all the expertise and you don't have a great eye for it, it's so much easier to teach the kids how to throw a medicine ball or
Sure.
throw a
Yeah.
sandbag,
Yeah.
to work on those power components than it is to try to learn how to do the clean and teach it to 60 kids. So
Yeah.
like economically, not only is it, maybe more bang for your buck in terms of like measurable outcomes for the kids, but it's also a lot easier to manage as a coach.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you guys feel this way, but my process constantly changes,
Hmm.
develops, grows. And one thing that keeps me interested because I have like a high, I would like, if I could rate my curiosity, it's like a 10 out of 10.
Uh-huh.
And my work ethic's like probably up there. And so I'm like always trying to just educate myself and learn about things that I'm interested in. And when I don't feel interested in it, I just like set it aside. So to keep like weightlifting and powerlifting and S&C really interesting, like I'm just constantly iterating and trying to
Yeah.
improve my process. So instead of getting rid of things, I'm almost like pulling them in of like, oh, I need to learn more about jumping,
Right.
like plyometrics
Right.
and like different movements we can do, different structures of like setting them up, juxtaposing them to like other
Yeah.
pieces within the training. So, to coaches who are thinking like, I don't know weightlifting, so I won't do it. It's like, well, fucking learn it, figure it out. And you don't
Right.
have to be
Yeah.
perfect, but it's
Yeah.
like, just play around with it. Maybe
Mhm.
there isn't any utility, but I don't think you'd be worse off by being better at it.
Yeah. 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 That's 100% true. Yeah.
Yeah, we still throw it in,
Yeah.
you know, it's for as much as I can. Now,
Yeah.
like you were saying, like I'm not walking around telling people to target their back foot.
Yeah.
My kids,
Yep.
they're splitting. It's like just this little
Yeah.
like it's like, dude, come on, guys, like let's watch this video. And they're like, oh yeah, yeah, I got it. It's
Yeah.
like, all right,
Yeah.
you're lucky you could deadlift a lot.
You're lucky you can deadlift a lot. They carry you a long ways. Um, so we mentioned a little bit about like basic training principles for strength training, volume, intensity, tempo, frequency, all those kinds of things, right? Do you have, with your deep dive into plyometrics, have you started to develop your own like characteristics or principles for doing plyometrics at all yet?
So I'm not gonna answer that, and
Okay.
I was almost well I'm gonna answer it, but I was almost hoping you wouldn't bring up like conditioning because I'm
Okay.
like conditioning. I need to crack that open
Uh-huh.
and just learn. I need to
Yeah,
learn
yeah.
a lot. But with plyos, I would say you guys know Sportsmith? I think that's what it's
That
called.
sounds real familiar.
But they have like a plyo series, and my buddy Chris Tabor, who's like uh he got his doctorate from ETSU.
He's scheduled to be
And
on in a week.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So, and he's at Sacred Heart. He's super sharp guy, like really, really sharp. He makes me sound like a bumbling, babbling moron. But he sent me some articles from Sportsmith, which is like plyometric training. It's like a 2 or 3 part series. And that's literally the framework I use. It starts with like low impact, um, more kind of like limiting the stress shortening cycle
Uh-huh.
to, maybe you're doing like pogos, hands on hips pogos, right? Maybe you're doing like seated box jumps.
Yeah.
And then you're going to sequence that or progress into maybe you're doing standing box jumps, standing vertical jumps, then continuous jumps, then depth jumps. So like that, like sequence, that process of going from kind of lower impact, less stretch shortening cycle, less like eccentric loading or
Uh-huh.
landing and absorbing to integrating higher forces, faster ground contacts. That's the basic process I
Yeah.
use so far. And a lot of it, honestly, has just been like, I need to do more of it because the kids are slow. They don't have good pop. And they
Uh-huh.
talk about like not being able to jump well. And they'll come into the weight room, I'll watch them jump, and it's like, I didn't know your arms could go the opposite way. Like
Yeah,
Oh
as you
yeah,
jump up,
yeah.
your arms go down. Like I didn't know you could do that. So
Jumping
like
down, we call that jumping down. Yeah.
so it's like, okay, well, at least I know how to jump, so I can teach you like hands up on the toes, dip down, big arm swing, whatever. And then we can start to introduce it, get exposure to it. And then I can start to play around with like, what's my flavor of incorporating jumps, lower body, upper body plyos, and integrating that into like a more performance-based plan that goes from extensive or more volume, more strength work, slower to faster,
Uh-huh.
maybe lighter, more dynamic, maybe a little bit more volume with like jumps and plyos.
Yeah, I had kind of always thought of it as like a continuum like that, where, obviously you can dial volume, the amount that you jump, but then it's the concentric to eccentric continuum,
Yeah.
right? So
Yep.
seated jumps to depth drops.
Yeah.
Um, and man, I've seen or heard some crazy stories about people doing depth drops. I was talking to a friend of ours was a strength and conditioning coach, and she was telling me that they had a guy who he'd read super training, and so he did all the math on like how big of a depth drop he needed, and he would do like a depth drop from a second story balcony onto a mat, and he would like tape up his knees ahead of time,
Wow.
and um I get what he was going for, but then
Yeah.
once you put a mat in and start wrapping your knees and stuff, you're already taking out the portion of it that you're supposed to be responsible for, like the actual value of the depth drop,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I'd always thought about it as kind of that continuum. Like you can do a huge amount of seated box jumps and not wear out your kids. You can do
Oh,
six
totally.
depth drops 3 weeks in a row and they're toast, and so
Yeah.
like that continuum of like how much eccentric is it and how much concentric and then how much volume. But then the other thing that I've really gotten into lately is um the skill component of jumping. Like,
Mm.
jumping off of both feet, like right foot first, or jumping off both feet, left feet first, trying to touch with your right hand, trying to touch with your left hand, trying to touch with both hands.
Yeah.
I got a huge amount of mileage out of doing that. Just because it would turn out like, oh, this kid just can't jump off of their right foot at all,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so like as soon as you start making them do it and they learn how to do that skill, right? So finding ways to break down like the skill component
Yeah.
of having some volition and acting on purpose, is kind of the other thing that I'm real interested in exploring some more. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think like good strength coaches have like an extensive Rolodex of movements that
Right.
they can pull from because, what's the difference between like do you guys know what a miracle grow is? Like laying on your
No.
back, you have the dumbbell kind of over your chest, and then you like extend back, drop to the ground, press
Sure.
up.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, yeah, you could do that like laying down. You could also do that kind of seated here, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like, well, what's the difference? Like, I don't know if there's a huge difference, but at least I get like two blocks out of, each
right.
one.
Yeah.
Right.
And seeing that is like, okay, well, maybe we'll do like a row, a barbell row where the weight's on the ground.
Hmm.
One we do it without on the ground. One we do it with dumbbell. It's like, okay, how are we going to sequence all this so that like those big things like load will change and speed will change, but also we're just doing things that are kind of engaging, interesting, and target that skill component, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
so that we can get a lot of mileage out of those movements or like those different patterns. I actually like the way of thinking about that, so I'm gonna steal
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Yeah, I always thought the weight room was a great tool. Like I got speed and power in spades. I'm stronger, faster than everybody, but I'm clumsy as all get out. And so, I was never super successful in sport and like that was a big part of it, but the weight room has been a remarkable tool for
Mm,
like just learning how to move.
wow. Yeah.
And same thing. And that also comes with added benefits too, right? You change exercises, just the variation of it, right? Some
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of
Totally.
row every
Yep.
6 weeks or whatever, and that systemic fatigue that you battle goes way down.
Yeah.
So, you also run in that issue of like I'm not grinding the same gear, even though I'm still working the same muscles and everything and getting benefit out of it, it helps a little bit with, feeling fresh,
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
not getting run down. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. I got a curveball here.
Curveball.
Monroe's random ass question.
Oh, this is a daily feature.
Yep.
Okay.
Daily. Once so if and your answer actually might be there. You've been on enough podcasts. If you could choose, and I guess it doesn't have to be training, who would be your number one podcast guest? So it could be training. Maybe it's
Okay.
someone that you might be like, I've already had it. We had it last week.
Yeah. Is it dead or alive?
Sure.
Sure. Why not? Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a dead and alive.
Just for
Okay.
context, I forgot who was the guest on it, but it was who could you train, and he picked a really realistic person. My person was Jesus.
Musashi. Yeah, you
So,
picked a really realistic
I
person.
thought that
Yeah.
was a pretty badass person. Jesus at running back was
Yeah.
an interesting idea, but
Yeah. So yeah, alive or dead,
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe both.
Yeah. Let's see. So alive. Yeah, I would definitely go with Jordan Peterson. I
Okay.
don't. Yeah. I started the in lines with that personality paper that we did. Um, I'm like huge into personality, just like a pet interest. I just read about the big five. I read about different aspects of personality, thought, feelings, emotions,
Right.
how people change across time, if they do change. And Jordan Peterson had like a personality series just like on podcast and through Spotify. So I started listening to like, oh, here are like the big five, like extroversion, openness,
Right.
agreeableness, neuroticism. And then I started getting into his like biblical lectures. And then I started getting into his lectures where he talks about the major ideas and themes from different psychologists, different philosophers, different like philosophical schools. And then I was like, holy shit, this is fucking awesome. Like you're telling me like all these things we contend with and think about and deal with that have been talked about in like mythological form, like someone fighting a dragon or someone
Right.
going on a hero's journey or hero's adventure. You're like, oh, like this guy's like breaking it down, talking about it, making it understandable. And he had a lot of like really strong concepts that helped me take more responsibility as a person of just like, yeah, confront the thing you're afraid of because that's where like meaning is. Like you're avoiding it for a
Uh-huh.
reason. It's because
Yeah.
it's hard and scary, so you should probably do it. So Jordan Peterson would be freaking awesome. That'd be like unbelievable. And then dead, I would say, well, one person who's really shaped the way I think about like interpersonal relationships and then maybe just like intrapersonal stuff would be Carl Rogers. So I don't know if you guys would be familiar with him.
No.
But he was a psychologist. He wrote a few books. One's called On Becoming a Person. He wrote, some textbooks and it's like huge figure in psychology and had a bunch of influence on the way that field kind of moved in terms of like how therapists interact with
Uh-huh.
patients or treated.
Was he one of
Uh,
the early um advocates for like do I like either cognitive or behavioral therapy?
So he was like, so he did like patient-centered, like client-centered therapy, and he's actually the guy. So I don't know if you've ever heard this advice, but when people tell you, like, if you're having a conversation with someone, repeat the last few words that they say back to
Uh-huh.
them, and then they'll be like, be aware that you're listening. I think he like came up with that technique.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
But anyways, he was like he was part of this like humanist tradition, just a super authentic, thoughtful, like real person who talked
Uh-huh.
about this idea of like um, congruence, like when you're incongruent, right? When you're doing and saying things that aren't in alignment with who you want to be, that
Right.
causes like internal friction and battle. So he would talk about like different qualities like that, having empathy for people. It's just being a good person, right?
Yeah.
And being able to communicate and have those relationships with other people. So he's a huge influence on me, and I, honestly credit a lot of that stuff to the way I am able to relate and communicate, and form relationships with people. Which, like we said with coaching, that's like the basis of it, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like, do people want to compete for you, for various reasons, and then do they want to show up and like represent, you know, who you are as a person, but like who collectively you are. So that idea of a good person is just foundational to all of that stuff. So those are definitely two people I would podcast with.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting
Yeah.
choices. Josh?
Oh, well, mine now sound just stupid. Like yours were awesome and like
I was gonna say Godzilla, so we're on.
at first, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Uh, this is a weird one. I would love like like I like serial killer documentaries and things like that. Like to interview someone that was like on like the Ted Bundy case or
Okay.
Oh
someone that was
wow.
like
Yeah, yeah.
following, or even like the jailer that discovered he had jumped out the second story window and got out.
Yeah.
Like
Who
I
was
would love
the
to be able to talk to that person. Like, how did you just quit? Like, did you just walk home right there? Or were you the one that went and told the judge, like, oh, I just let Bundy escape?
there was the
Wow.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun.
Like I would love to
See how he feels about that
yeah,
30
like
years
holy
later.
crap, that was a mistake.
Who was I mean, now you got me on serial killers. Ed Kemper, was that?
Yeah.
He apparently would like hang out at police bars to try to talk to them about investigations and
Oh
stuff
my gosh.
that were his murders,
Right.
And
Wow.
so that would be an interesting group of police to interview and just be like, what was that like?
But then also like, who I think would be a blast to talk to? Ronnie Coleman.
Oh,
Yeah.
Ron,
I'd love to
great.
just
Yeah.
sit in a
Yeah.
freaking room and watch, just show him. I love watching him watch things. What a weird thing to say. Like I love hearing Ronnie Coleman either talk shit about something or laugh. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But there's a lot. I think, yeah, I'm going to assume that the guy that let Bundy go on accident is dead.
Yeah.
So I'll pick him
Okay.
and then Ronnie Coleman.
Okay.
Yeah. I think to that point, like what would be awesome is having Ronnie Coleman next to you and then having him react to old Ronnie Coleman videos, like him eating rice and
Yeah.
like barbecue sauce, rice, chicken, going and training, like cut off, sleeveless, just the biggest man you can imagine, yelling lightweight baby,
Yeah.
squatting like 700-800 pounds for like
Uh-huh.
reps.
His police uniform is
Yeah.
my favorite. It's just tight ass cut off shorts with a cut off shirt. Like, can you imagine being arrested by that man? Like,
It'd be terrifying.
Yeah, one of my favorite, of his recent appearances and stuff is people ask him if he's got any regrets because he obviously had all the complications from the back injuries
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah.
But he's like, yeah, my only regret is that I didn't squat 800 for 5 when I was doing it. Like
Wow.
that's my only regret.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I
Yeah.
really like this guy.
That-
Me and him are on the same page.
that is a good point of like doing stuff You don't know when that
Yeah.
last chance is going to happen.
Uh-huh.
So when you have the physical ability, you should take advantage of it.
Do it.
You know what I mean? You don't
Well, I
know.
mean, I like to that point. The one thing that I found, you kind of mentioned Ronnie and my buddy. So you guys know Weightlifting House, like the brand.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the guy who runs it, his name's Seb. He spent some. He'd be a great guest, by the way. He spent some time in Qatar, and he was at a training camp with Ilya Ilyin, who's like
Okay. Yeah,
famed
phenomenal weightlifter.
weightlifter.
Yeah.
Yeah, like one of the best of all time. Got popped, obviously. He was one of the so in 2012, the 94 kilo class, I think it was at the Olympics, like the top out of the top 10, I think like 7 or 8 got popped.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that like you have guys at the bottom of the top 10 rolling into third, rolling
Yeah,
into
rolling into gold medals.
yeah, who like winning medals, right? So Seb's in Qatar. He's like living in the training camp where Ilya Ilyin's training.
Yeah.
And he like sets up with Ilya and they just start watching Ilya's old training videos. And Ilya's just like sobbing, just talking about like what it was like, just like reacting to his own lifting. It's
Yeah.
like I couldn't imagine what that would be like with someone like a Ronnie Coleman, who
Uh-huh.
just, he's like in such a, I don't know how to talk about it, but like, he's lived a lot of life now
Yeah.
and he's responding back to the way things used to be. But when I hear about that and you kind of make that comment about Ronnie, it's like how important is it to have a story that you want to tell and look back on and just like would be so emotion evoking and so just like so fucking weird and different. You're like, I can't believe that was my life. Like to me, that's like a successful life lived.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh yeah, you just like, oh
Think of
god,
all, on your 50th birthday, everybody sits down and you have to look at a movie of your life.
Yeah.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people that's going to be a sad movie. Like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? I
totally,
don't know that I want
yeah.
to watch that movie right now. Like,
A lot of Instagram.
so yeah, like, man, I got real good at Sudoku. Like, hey, Sudoku. But yeah, like that might be a good way to, try to live your life.
Yeah.
Better be interesting when you look back on it.
Yeah. It's interesting. We just found a grip of family photos like from when we were kids, and so I'm like, man, that was, 30, 35 years ago.
Yeah,
And it feels like a whole different life. Like I
yeah,
wonder if
totally.
Coleman has that same experience. Like if he watches training videos now, if he's like, because I know he still trains, so
Yeah,
maybe he sees it
yeah,
and he's like, oh hell yeah, I'm 6 months away from doing that again.
yeah,
That's how I live my life.
Yeah, always assuming you're going to get back, which
yeah.
maybe that's a good way to live too. You don't ever have to feel like you're on the other side.
Yeah, well,
Enough surgeries, he's going to get that 800-pound squat back.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is maybe a good question. How many lifters have you coached like essentially to retirement? Have you
Ooh,
had anybody yet in your career?
I haven't, no. And
Okay.
I've worked with people. So I've probably been coaching professionally for like 8 years.
Yeah.
And I think I still work with like my very first power lifter.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and she's like, it's insane. One, like how great of a friendship we have, but like how committed you are to see like 8 years of powerlifting
Uh-huh.
through.
8 years in
Uh,
powerlifting is a lifetime.
yeah. Yeah, and she's like killing it, right? And it's funny because she's like the program's so dialed in, but being able to experience that and then also getting to where I know for her, she probably never thought she was going to be very strong or like very good at it. And then seeing her squat massive fucking weights is
Uh-huh.
so rewarding to me of like, I can't believe you got that fucking strong.
Yeah.
Like, because you just see kids, I kind of get this in the weight room at the high school. It's like, okay, you're a 14-year-old female, never lifted a weight before. You're coming in, you're barely doing the bar. You can't do cleans because you literally can't pull the bar high enough. It's like too heavy.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then I'll have, a year and a half later, it's like you're squatting 155 pounds for a set of 8 and you're crushing it, you're blowing it up. You're overhead squatting more weight than most of this girls in the school can even like fathom.
Uh-huh.
It's like, okay, like you made great progress. Like you turned what like was okay, I can barely move the bar to I'm moving big weights, as a 15-year-old. So I haven't seen that like them through to retirement, but I've worked with people for like 5, 8, uh, closing on 10 years, but not from start to finish. Not from start to finish.
Yeah. Yeah, Max and I talked about that because, both of us ended on injury. And so,
Yeah,
I still lived in delusion for several years after that I was going to somehow get back to it or whatever. So we talked
yeah,
a little bit about, having the conversation with your athletes like, hey, sport's not going to, you probably aren't going to be competing at the world level forever,
yeah,
right? So
totally.
like what's your plan for afterwards, you know?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I work with someone now. So she last last 3 years. So 3 years ago she was seventh in the nation in the 100 plus kilo class. Next year she was fifth in the same class. Next year she was fifth as a 100 kilo lifter. So she went from like weighing 112 kilos and she weighed in the other day at like
okay.
91.5, like
Yeah.
lost like pretty much like 50 pounds. And she was like one of the best at super heavyweight, drop down. And then at the Arnold, she's going to compete as a 90 kilo like athlete. And I think she's been doing it for like 5 years. But you start having these conversations when you go from super heavyweight, which is, how do you get strong? You put on size. How do
Yeah.
you put
Right.
on size? Like
Yeah.
you gain a lot of weight.
Yeah.
And she went from that and squatting like 500, pulling 500 to 90 kilos. And like training's hard when the weight on the bar comes off because you've lost so much body weight
Yeah.
and you've changed multiple weight classes. It's like, okay, you're still as competitive, but the weights are different. The way you move's different. Everything feels just different enough. Um, so you start having those conversations of like, okay, we got to get some momentum. We got to almost find that delusion of, yeah, we can get back there if we just
Right.
like dial things in correctly. Um, and we could try to maintain a high level of performance as long as we can. So I think part of that like delusion though that you're talking about is like really beneficial.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
coaches like thrive on it for sure. So I've
Yeah,
hit situations though.
I
Yeah.
have a super talented young lady that I just wish would catch the delusion
Yeah.
right now.
Oh man.
She young lady, unfortunately, with I won't be able to take her to nationals this year, but I mean, as a junior, she's a heavyweight, but she's like 245 pounds, so she
Okay.
could drop
Yeah.
a little bit. But as a junior in high school, deadlifted 445 and squatted
Wow. Yeah.
435 with
In her
just
first year.
wonderful, wonderful form. Like
Yeah.
could go to the moon,
Wow.
bench 200, and just bubbly personality, like awesome
Uh-huh.
to be
Yeah.
around. But she don't really want to do it.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
She's
girl, you
got
could just have like you could live with an Instagram, just making jokes, being strong. Go live somewhere. Somebody will pick
Yeah.
you up.
Yeah, she's got one of my favorite
Wow.
quotes. We were in the weight room and somebody was trying something and they were feeling kind of bashful about it. And she was like, "You just got to realize that you're a bad bitch and get after it." And I was like, "I love this girl.
Wow.
I don't know what
Yeah.
she's
That's
doing, but
great.
But it's like,
yeah,
damn,
so
man.
talented. So talented."
Hopefully somebody catches her.
Okay, we gave lots of advice for coaches. For kids, what's your advice for kids who are getting into a sport? What would you tell them to do? What would you tell them to be? Who would you tell them to aim for?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying
Uh,
to think of like a
Yeah.
pithy way, like a pithy, like short way to say it. I'm trying to, man, beyond like the major life lessons, that's really hard. Um, I mean, I don't know if it's really anything you could tell them. It's like the feeling they have. Like it's what it's ultimately like kind of to Josh's point. It's like you can get kids who are super talented, they'll show up and then you won't see them again, and then they'll show up and you won't see them again. It's like, yeah, but you're really good. It's like they don't really care about being good at it.
Uh-huh.
But I think, I have kids who will come in only because their friends come in, or
Yeah.
only because they love the weight room, even if they're
Yeah.
not that good. So I think a lot of it's like I would take all the time I would spend kind of explaining and standing on a soapbox and preaching to, can I make an environment that the kid wants to come back to, and that he's going to enjoy it enough, or she's going to enjoy it enough, or they will enjoy it enough to where it's like, oh yeah, there's a lift after school. I'm gonna show up. And on top of that, though, it's also the coach passing that down to the kids
Yeah.
and saying like, hey, lift is this time. It's mandatory. It's not whatever. But like coming from the coach, coming from the weight room, coming from the strength coach, if you like are able to triangulate that, I think you're gonna keep them like in that life cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we always are, as a coach, you always love working with the kids who are the psychopaths and will work until you tell them to stop,
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
show up every day and they just keep going. We
yeah.
just had a guest on whose advice was to be okay being vulnerable. And I was
Okay.
like, man, that's great advice for
Yeah,
a
yeah,
young athlete because, it's hard to get started.
yeah,
What
yeah,
was your
yeah.
story about your first day wrestling where you got matched up with a girl?
Yeah, they passed out singlets and they were like, all right, tomorrow you and you are wrestling, you and you, and it was a girl I had a crush on, and I was like, I'm not coming back, man. First off, she's gonna beat me. I
Yeah.
have no shot. I learned later that I had no shot anyways. I should have just wrestled her, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, I was like, I can't do that.
Yeah.
There's no way I'm failing in front of everybody here.
Yeah, you got to be vulnerable. You got to
Yep.
get out there and do stuff.
Well, I
It's
think,
scary.
but I mean, to that point, one thing that I've kind of thought about a lot recently is instead of telling someone like, "Hey, that thing you did was really good, and you're only worthy because of that thing," it's like, hey, it's instilling this idea of like, no, you're a hard worker. Like
Uh-huh.
you're a badass. You work really hard.
Right.
You really care about this thing. That
Uh-huh.
idea of like those bigger picture like self concepts, that's the gold, right? It's
Yeah.
not just like, oh, that squat was really good. It's like you worked really hard to make that lift.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you're right. Like I did work my ass off. And I am
Right.
someone who works hard and shows up. So I think just like reframing past that like achievement oriented mindset, but like
Uh-huh.
more person oriented or kid
Yeah.
oriented, where you're just instilling those self beliefs. I think you got
Yeah.
to really hammer
And
those, right?
yeah, you never know when that's gonna click. Seventh grade
Totally.
JV basketball, I won Mr. Hustle, the Mr.
Oh, there you
Hustle
go.
award.
Yeah.
That defined the way I
Did everything
do
for the rest
everything
of
for
your
the rest
life.
of my life. I don't know what he saw. I guess maybe I was hustling around, but it was the first thing I ever won. Now, no matter what, I hustle. And it's
I
Yeah.
like, what a cool seed that a coach probably didn't even know. I probably should have told
Right.
him.
yeah. I
You
remember shooting him a letter or
Yeah.
a text message or something. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Like, I keep asking you, like, what can athletes bring to the table? And you're like, it's my responsibility to teach them to be good
Yeah.
people. And I'm like, this
Yeah.
guy's solid. I like this guy.
Yeah.
Um, so before we, because we're already like 2 hours in, I don't want to keep you all night. I mean, I'll sit here and talk for 12 hours. We can do a 12-hour podcast, but I
Sure.
won't keep you forever. But so I read your paper. Was that the first paper that you were the lead author on?
Yeah, yeah.
The
And that was
personalities.
so kind of to Josh's like Mr. Hustle thing. When I started, I was the co-host on the Weightlifting House podcast for a long time. And I still do shows with Seb, but he called me the people scientist.
Uh-huh.
And I thought to myself, like, I haven't done science. Like I've never published a paper.
Right.
So I'm just like an imposter, right? And everyone would call me the people scientist. Like you get a nickname like that, and then people like know you by that thing.
Uh-huh.
And and then I couldn't live with it. Like I can't live with being inauthentic.
Uh-huh.
So what did I do? I like recruited Chris. We put a survey out through Weightlifting House. We got 160 whatever like
Right.
elite regional national level coaches, and they took this personality inventory and got it published like 3 years later, and suddenly it's like, okay, I'm a scientist. So
Yeah.
that happened from me being given a nickname about being a scientist
I
to
love that.
turning into needing to be a scientist. So I got that. I was working on that before this like doctorate.
Okay.
Uh, so I haven't published anything else, and everything I will publish will kind of be on the back end of this degree. So it's like that was like a passion project.
Yeah. Was there any interesting? So I saw in there the only statistically significant takeaway was the difference in agreeableness between male and female coaches.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Which isn't a surprise, it's because statistically speaking, there's a difference in agreeableness between men and women.
yeah.
But was there anything in doing that process that really stood out to you that was like a cool takeaway for if you want to do more research or if you want to if somebody else is interested in, dissecting the psychology of effective coaches that you think is worth talking about?
So what it does tell me is that I would love to see it done again, like replicated.
Uh-huh.
But we want to do when I have time, we want to do it with athletes and say
Yeah.
like they're like an athlete profile to where
Yeah.
certain athletes have certain character traits or a personality disposition. I think that coaches, especially elite level coaches, have to. I don't know how they don't score higher in conscientiousness, like work ethic.
Yeah.
Like like if you're an elite level coach, like you have to have a sick work ethic to like be so persistent, do something for so long at such a high level. So that was confusing to me. But I think the same reason why a coach can be successful, even if they're not a good coach, in weightlifting is because the athlete will make the coach,
Uh-huh.
Yep. That's what I was
right?
gonna say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like a freak comes through your door and they're like, oh, like Shane Hammond, he was
Yeah, I know weightlifter, heavyweight US men's. Yeah,
yeah,
monstrously powerful.
yeah, snatched 197.5, clean
Uh-huh.
and jerks like 237.5 or something like that. And hasn't been beat. Those records are like long-standing, 25 years still, and no one except maybe Aaron Williams can touch them. And we did a podcast with him, and I think he said something along the lines of he like walked in the weight room, he was like 13 years old, and I don't know if I'm gonna get this right or wrong, but it was something along the lines of he squatted like 400 to 500 pounds. The
First time,
first time
yeah.
he touched, yeah, it's like
Yeah.
touched the bar like 500 pounds, bench 300. You're like, no way, Josh, you're a fucking liar. I don't trust anything you said.
I believe it.
This guy, this guy snatched almost 440,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
like he clean and jerked, like over 500 pounds. And he squatted. I mean, it's in gear, but like he squatted 1,000 pounds. But Shane Heyman walks in. It's like, yeah, I mean, he's gonna make you look like a genius from day one.
Uh-huh.
So coaches can be elite level coaches without being good, good coaches necessarily, like good programmers, good technicians. You have
Right.
to know something, but like you don't have to be like just grinding yourself into a pulp to become an expert.
Yeah.
Just in the same way that athletes, if you're in what I call a CGS sport, like a centimeter, gram, or second,
Right.
those are so dependent on just basic physiological qualities. If you're fast, you don't really have to, you're fast, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you can be born fast. You can be
Yeah.
born strong. You can
There
be
are sprint bodies and shot put bodies and
There
yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a story about the high jumper who like never done it before, went out for it, fucking like blew it up.
Yeah.
I don't know his name. I
Seven
think
foot two
it's
or whatever.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. So you can be naturally talented at something, and then as a coach you can get those naturally talented people. So beyond that stuff, I would say coaches work hard. I can't prove that. I don't
Yeah.
know. Certain.
Every study is a request for further study, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah, yeah,
when I
yeah.
was reading that, part of what I was thinking was, I wonder if the Big Five is the right personality survey. Like maybe there's something where you need to construct your own test for, the idea of people who are performing and then send it to coaches who are effective and coaches who aren't effective. And then also like how do you control for the athlete?
Yeah,
All those
totally.
kinds of things, right? Like it would be really interesting, to see like, hey, there was nothing statistically significant among my coaches who weren't or who were effective, but the 400 coaches I sent it to who have never
Yeah,
coached anybody, they all had this in common. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
that would be
totally.
an interesting, other side of the coin.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I hope I would be interested in hearing you kind of pick Chris's brain about it too. See
Oh
what you
yeah.
think. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'll ask him. I'll ask him. Yeah, he's hopefully, I don't want to count my chickens before they're hatched, but he's scheduled for the 18th. So yeah, cool. All right. Well, did you have anything else? We have the philosophical weightlifting
Yep.
podcast. Are you doing anything else that we can plug for you?
Oh, I would say if people are interested in weightlifting and powerlifting coaching, you can reach out. Honestly, I generally push people to other companies that I really believe in. So Weightlifting House, my buddy, Seb, who started that in 2017, like he's just taken that from an idea to like making an internationally known, reputable brand. Go support him. I would support Max. He created an app. I mean,
Yeah, the
he
weightlifting AI. Yeah.
yeah, weightlifting AI, Coach Logic, like from scratch. They developed it from scratch. They put so much money and time into that. Like, go support them. Onyx Straps has supported me as a sponsor to the podcast, and they, they make all their like leather goods, in-house. They do all the stitching, all the production. I'd
Yeah.
go support them. And then if you want to learn about weightlifting, Max and I wrote the Weightlifter's Guide to the Snatch and the Weightlifter's Guide to the Clean and Jerk. You can pick that up at weightliftinghouse.com. Other than that, just listen to the podcast.
If you do you have an episode? So if I was going to send somebody to get hooked onto your podcast,
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
have one where you're like, oh my God,
What's your best one?
242 is the
Yeah.
best.
I have three. Okay.
Okay.
So the first one's going to be if you just want to listen to people who have done really freaky shit, listen to the podcast with Olivia Reeves,
Okay.
who's Olympic champion, world champion, and then IWF World Cup champion all in the same year, 71 kilo female. Like she was the only female, I think, at Worlds to win who wasn't like from a non-Asian country. It's the only
Oh,
woman
okay.
from a non-Asian country to win one of the weight classes. Um, she's insane. Like she squatted like 218 kilos at 71. It's like roughly, 45,
That's real
475.
impressive.
Yeah, she snatches 265, 120 kilos, clean and jerks 150. So I did 3 podcasts with her. I'd listened to all 3. I'd say from a coaching standpoint, there are a lot of great podcasts. If you're looking S&C, I did an episode with Paul Comfort, who's like huge name in S&C. That was a fantastic episode, really, really fun. And then if you're interested in the psychological stuff, I did one with Stephen Hayes, and he basically created this idea of acceptance and commitment therapy. It's like a hugely known, hugely practiced form of therapy, and he's brilliant. He's like a genius. So those are
Those
the
would be
those are
the
the 3
three.
people I'd look for.
I
Yeah.
like that.
All
I
right.
like that a lot. All right.
All right, Josh. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're at 275, you know what I mean? We'll have a party.
Yeah.
Um,
When you guys are at 275, I'll have you both on my podcast. How about that?
oh,
Yeah.
then you can ask us questions and see what kind of crazy things we talk about.